We're going through Kenneth Smith's book, Millennia and Microcosm. We're in the middle section, Medieval Civilization. We're in chapter 9 and we're on paragraph 3. The link is there in the text. And when I say we're on paragraph 3, I really mean we're on the first sentence of paragraph 3, which is where we were last week and where we were the week before that. And it's where we're going to be today, because this is one of Kenneth's juicy sentences, which you find from time to time, where he says a little bit, but it actually means an enormous amount. Uh, David wrote us this lovely intro, as is his wont, which I will read. Rick argues, he's pointing out that I've inserted a little too much of myself into this seminar, not enough Kenneth. Rick argues that some of the earliest Jesus movement traditions, preserved by Paul, point to a simple core message about Jesus' death and the community's ongoing practice of remembrance, reflecting a movement centered on a human teacher and a lived way of life rather than later, more elaborate theological systems. And yes, this is what we've been talking about. We talked about it in depth last week. We're going to talk about it in depth next week. But humorously, now that David has put a summary that points out the fact that I'm burning up 2 hours of every 3 hours talking about medieval writers, today I'm not going to do that. This is the perfect intro for last week and next week. Today I'm going to give Kenneth Smith more focus. And to give him more focus, I'm gonna harp on the same one sentence we were on last week and the week before, because it's such a juicy sentence. There's so much to it. We'll see if we can unpack it and get all the way through it today, so we can move on to the rest of paragraph 3 next week. For those who are just joining us, our approach generally is based on the idea that Kenneth Smith, as a philosophy teacher, professor in the past, before he became a full-time philosopher, he references other philosophers. He references other writers of literature, artists, musicians, historians, public speakers. He points basically outward from himself. He's not trying to create a cult. He's trying to get people to learn about philosophy. And so the way to read Kenneth Smith's text is not as quickly as you can, making assumptions about what he's saying. It's to slow way the hell down. And every time he says something that is a reference to something you don't understand, just stop and go find out what that thing is. That's what we've been doing. That's why after 177 weeks, we're only on chapter 9. So we're taking our time with this. We would rather understand it and what he's talking about, and explore our understanding of the world and philosophy inspired by what he's saying, than just adhere to any kind of schedule and declare that we're done on a certain date, even if we haven't actually understood a damn thing that he said. So this is an exercise in patience and exploration and philosophy, direct philosophy. Today, a lot of what we're going to talk about is other things that Kenneth Smith or others have said that pertain to this sentence. The sentence is so important because it's one of the first places where he's foreshadowing in real depth what he's going to talk about in the final third section of the book. When we finish up with medieval civilization, we'll turn to modern civilization. And what he's doing in this book that's so clever is he's having us focus on learning to see the way that the ancients saw, then having us focus on learning to see the way that the medievals saw. That's what we're working on now. And then, armed with those two things, in the final third of this seminar, we'll go back and look at ourselves. But we'll look at ourselves from those two perspectives, not from the modern perspective. And what we'll see will be amazing, because we look very different from those eyes. And here he's foreshadowing that. He's giving us a little glimpse forward. And in this glimpse, he is comparing and contrasting, even though he doesn't name the ancient or classical worldview. He isn't. It is here implicitly. He's critiquing that. He's critiquing the medieval worldview. He's critiquing the modern worldview, all at the same time. And what he has to say is this. This is the chewy sentence. What is hard for Christians, no less than for moderns in general, to comprehend, is the extent of the artificialism that dominates their inner lives. Now, last week we talked about the fact that this opening is not saying all Christians. He's talking about moderns. He's saying what's hard for modern Christians, no less than for other moderns, is the way to read that opening. This is not so much a statement about medievalism. He's what he's underscoring in part is the difficulty that we have in understanding a medieval worldview stems from two major things. And one of them is that in historical and philosophical studies, almost everybody for the last century just skips the medieval era. They go back and they study ancient history and they study Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, and then they jump ahead 1500 years and then we start studying the moderns, and that's it. We just skip that. Everybody calls it a dark age. But when they call it a dark age, they think they're describing the age, they're actually describing themselves. It is we whose minds, when it comes to medieval era, are dark because we just ignore this era. We don't understand this era. So first of all, there's a big tabula rasa where we each ought to have a lot of details because a lot of things happened. Important things happened during that 1,000-year period. But the second thing that makes it hard for us is that we understand that in Europe, it is an era of Christianity in conflict with itself, in conflict with Islam, in conflict with Judaism, in conflict with pagans and heathens. We understand Christianity to be somewhere near the center of the bullseye of issues associated with medieval Europe. But the problem is we don't understand medieval Christianity. We understand modern Christianity. And modern Christianity is a very different animal from medieval Christianity. Even when it swears it's not, even the most hardcore, I am against modernity. I embrace Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy or what have you, and I stand as a protest against modernity. There are people like this. I mean, I've met people like this, but even they're moderns, even while they think that they're not, even while they think that they're opposed to modernity. We are in the modern epoch. We are subject to its zeitgeist. We've been marinating in it for 500 years. And the result is our entire interpretive framework for everything, including God and Jesus and religion and ourselves, is saturated with modernity. Even in our attempts to reject modernity, we reject it in a modern way that keeps us trapped within modernity. And he's alluding to this here in this opening. And this is an issue that's crossing thousands of years in a handful of words. Um, so it's hard for modern Christians, no less than for other moderns that's why he says moderns in general, to comprehend is the extent of what we're going to focus on is this week is the second half, the extent of the artificialism that dominates their inner lives, the artificialism that dominates their inner lives. So, Phil's not here, but I'm going to do that thing that we like to do. I'm going to evoke Phil. I'm going to summon the spirit of Phil and apply it here. Phil likes to talk about nature one and nature two. And he says, all animals, including ourselves, evolve to inhabit ecosystems and to find some sort of harmony with that ecosystem so that on the one hand, we can meet our needs and live and reproduce and carry on the species on the one hand. But on the other hand, that in the course of going about those activities, we don't destroy that ecosystem we depend upon. We instead make that ecosystem healthier so that the longer we're in the ecosystem, the greater the carrying capacity, the greater the chance in the future when various insults or catastrophes happen, that the carrying capacity of that ecosystem will be so strong that we will still be able to survive even under those conditions. Species that do these things survive. Species that don't do these things, that wear down their ecosystem, go extinct. And the classic example is the whole Earth used to be covered in anaerobic bacteria a few billion years ago. And anaerobic bacteria, oxygen is a poison to them. Anyone who studied chemistry knows oxygen is one of the most virulent chemicals in the entire chart. Periodic table of the elements, there's a reason oxygen and fire are associated with each other. Oxygen and rust are associated with each other. Oxygen wants to interact chemically, and it's perfectly happy to interact ionically, and it's perfectly happy to interact covalently, both major types of atomic bonds it can do. And it will tear things to pieces. And evolving to the point where living organisms could withstand being in the presence of oxygen took billions of years. It is probably the single most important thing that happened in the evolution of life on this planet, because everything changed after that. Even life from lifelessness was an easier trick than getting a form of life that could survive the presence of oxygen and use it. Because once you can survive it, you can figure out how to use it. And if you can use it, you get that it's like having gasoline in your engine. I mean, you have the capacity to have very powerful chemical reactions happen inside yourself in your metabolism. You can generate massive amounts of energy that aren't possible for anaerobic bacteria. It was a huge revolution. And ultimately, it led to the development of multicellular organisms. And, I mean, granted, we're all understandably self-involved because we're multicellular organisms. So it seems pretty glorious that those things evolved on this planet. But it's actually more important than just for self-centered reasons. I mean, many things became possible with the evolution of multicellular organisms. So nature, artificialism, the evolution of life, the ability so nature one and nature two, right? We talked about the two things that all living organisms have to do with respect to their environments. The challenge for Homo sapiens is that the way that we act in nature transforms the environment of nature into something different. And especially over the last 10,000 years, the longer we've been working at this, the more we have transformed this environment until our cities and towns are extraordinarily artificial habitats. This is what Phil says when he talks about nature one and nature two. He says nature one is what every other species on the planet has evolved to be good at. But Homo sapiens is the weird animal that modifies nature one to create nature two and then inhabits nature two. And it inhabits nature two whether nature two is good for it or not. The assumption is, there's some parts of it that obviously we'd like to be dry and warm at night, and having a roof over our head seems like a good idea. Having a fire or some other source of warmth seems good. A lot of these things are clean running water is good. A lot of these things seem obvious to us, but we also generate plastics and pollution, right? Microplastics inside our bodies do terrible things to us. Pollution from coal plants is responsible for enormous numbers of people having lung problems all over the world that they just say, oh, that must just be me. No, it's not you. We're changing our habitat from nature one to nature two, and our bodies never evolved to handle inhaling the, smoke from a coal plant. Go figure. Or the exhaust from an engine. Go figure. And so, as Phil says, there is this in the nature around us, what Heraclitus refers to as, one of the two coins of nature, the nature around us. There is an enormous amount of artificialism in the way that we live. We massively modify nature and then try to live in the second nature that we've created, even if that second nature poisons us and is makes us sick. And we can get to the point where we are so immersed in Phil's nature two that we forget about Phil's nature one. I don't know if you guys remember, it was a big deal in the newspapers in the late 80s, early 90s. Little kids in New York were interviewed about where they thought various things came from. And when they asked about where milk came from, they thought it came from the grocery store. They were horrified to hear where it really comes from. They had no experience with a farm. They had no experience with what are the fundamentals of life that are making their nature two possible. There's no clue at all. And many people are like that. Ginny, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I don't know. I heard this part that children who have absolutely no exposure to nature, dirt, whatever, they thought that chocolate milk came from brown cows, right? Yeah.
Brown cows.
Yeah, that's how ignorant they are they
Yeah.
have no exposure to nature.
Yes.
And what you said about oxygen, I never learned that in school. You're my biology teacher here, or sure. Gee whiz, Rick.
I like science. So, I was even from before first grade, I was raised in learning about evolution, and that's where I picked all this stuff up. So, yeah, geologists figured it out. They figured it out. They figured out that there are rocks that are so old there's no rust in them. You know the red rocks of the Navajo reservation, the red soil of Alabama, things like that. That red is rust. It comes from iron in the soil interacting with oxygen in the air, and it causes it to turn red as it rusts. But there are rocks on the earth that are so old, there's no red anywhere to be found in them. There are no iron oxides. And from that, geologists were able to figure out that the Earth's atmosphere back then didn't have any oxygen. Earth once was an anaerobic atmosphere. Ironically, For those who don't know the story, how did we get an oxygen atmosphere? Well, all these anaerobic bacteria, a byproduct of their metabolism was oxygen. And just like we can't eat poop, they couldn't stay around the oxygen. But thank God we have this gigantic atmosphere. The oxygen just could float away, disappear into the vast oceans of the atmosphere, and they'd be safe. And what they didn't think about is the fact that even though they were very tiny, there were very many of them. And over the course of billions of years of emitting oxygen, they gradually transformed the atmosphere until the atmosphere was poisonous to them. And then they all started dying off. And today, the only places you can find anaerobic bacteria are like, in sediments at the bottom of the ocean, or if you've ever gone to Yellowstone and you smell the sulfur pits, how sulfurous they are. That's because the anaerobic bacteria can live down inside the mud where they're safe from the oxygen. But if you dig up the mud and lay it out on, into the sun, all those anaerobic bacteria are like, "Ee," and they die. They're too much oxygen. So yeah, there was a huge inversion on this planet, a massive inversion. Bacteria terraformed the earth, not into something that they liked, but into something they hated that we like. Yay! Thank you, bacteria. So every time you take a breath, just think, thank you, bacteria. So artificialism. So when he says the extent of the artificialism that dominates their inner lives, this is also an allusion, a distant allusion to Heraclitus talking about our two natures. We are we are a kind of amphibian. Homo sapiens is an amphibian that inhabits two natures, and one nature is the nature around us. And this is the one we've been talking about with anaerobic bacteria and evolution and Phil's nature one and nature two. But we also have a nature inside of us, says Heraclitus, speaking on behalf of all the Greeks. He says, our inner nature, our ethos, is what determines our behavior. What do we want? What do we like? What do we notice? What do we care about? Equally important, as Kenneth Smith always stresses, what do we fail to notice? What do we fail to care about? What do we fail to take an interest in and act on? All of that is determined by our character, both our visuals areas and our blind spots. They both come from our inner nature. And the Greeks, they were very interested in ethos. They thought ethos was the secret to understanding everything about how they were going to organize politics and society and you name it, because they said by looking at the behavior of natural things, they said, behold how the acorn grows into an oak. The nature of the oak is inside the acorn. Even though there's no oak yet, it already has that nature. And the acorn, its nature drives it to behave in such a way that it becomes more and more oak-like if it survives over time. Its ethos, its inner nature is also a direction, a striving, an unfolding of new resources of order from within itself. It transforms itself. And thus they said their word for nature is phusis, which means becoming, because they see things always in a process of change. And they also had the term aliosis, which means othering. Everything is always becoming something else. And this is where the core idea, we are the fruits of our earlier selves, and we are the seeds of our future selves. This is the core of the Greek worldview. It's a naturalistic, fusocentric, fusocratic. That's the word. I'm gonna type that in there. Fusocratic ethos and worldview. The rule of nature. This is when, I bring this up because if Kenneth is talking about artificialism, artificial is the opposite of natural. And the people of the three periods in history that we're studying in this book, the people that cared the most about the opposite of what we are, who cared about naturalism, were the ancient Greeks. And so the classical worldview is implicitly there in the word artificialism, as well as the inner lives. Inner lives refers to inner nature. And so what he's saying here is something that is once you unpack it, what he says here is really disturbing to moderns especially, because we think in our inner life we are the most free and the most natural. We say, granted, civilization may force us to do all these things we don't want to do, but in my heart, In my, even if I'm in a concentration camp, inside my skull, I'm still free, say great Jewish thinkers who survived the Holocaust. And Kenneth Smith is saying, oh, you sweet summer child, would that that were true. But how can you be free when what you are was constructed by other people, not for your purposes, but for theirs? The artifice, what Phil sees as the nature one and nature two around us, applies inside us as well. A nature one, which might reflect most of the 300,000 years that our species has been around, maybe only 290,000 years of Homo sapiens, was fairly naturalistic in its inner life. But in the last 10,000 years, we've become increasingly deliberately self-cultivating. And I guess I should say more specifically, we've become increasingly deliberately cultivating of the people around us. So that to have them mature not according to their original natural inner nature, but to have them mature and develop according to our design for them, our artificial plan for them, as though that artificial plan could be as normal and natural and healthy as what nature had in mind for us. So we are products of 10,000 years of increasing artificialization in the cultivation of human beings. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I find it a bit crazy. Obviously, to a lot of people now, it's not crazy, but they claim their minds have been colonized. This is a new funny word they got going, and they're quite serious. And men older than me have, really taken up with this, at how they've been hard done by. That, well, for example, one guy was brought up amongst Jehovah's Witnesses, which was a serious case of colonization of the mind, if you like. But invariably, you're going to be born as an infant. Your mind is going to be colonized by something, by some culture. I mean, you couldn't, this crazy idea, the land of lost children, all the infants walk off and go to the park and leave the adults out of the picture, just isn't going to happen. It needs that mental information of your particular culture for you to interact with others in the greater extent of the word. So you're moving on to what is the artificialism of the inner life. And of course, we're taught a set of values. There's still a huge struggle as to what values are, but in philosophy, values are described as those things which are not facts. So, if we get a fact, we can create a value in physics. But in philosophy, when they talk about values, they're talking about the metaphysical values. How, for example, we talk about a general concept of good. Absolute nonsense. I might find certain things are good, and I react to them as good, and then I eat too many lollies. I thought they were good, and I eat too many, and now they're evil. But we've created this general concept of good and evil. We've taken out, oh, this is good, this is good, this is good. Is there one category of all the goods? And of course, after that, we personalize it, so we have a God and a devil. But yes, this is the interesting controversy. Our minds have been colonized. Oh no, I'm going to run around having a breakdown. I was never my true self. Something like this, and people are running around and rolling in the streets, and it's New York City, and everybody's panicking and running around. There's a lot of that going on at the moment. A lot of people running around in a state of panic. Anyway, I wonder what you make of that, Rick.
Thank you, Stephen. What you're doing is you're putting your finger on the core paradox. about natural versus artificial when it comes to our inner lives. Hi, Sharon. Welcome to the call. And Joe, welcome. So, Heraclitus tries to prepare us for the uncomfortable truth that, the truth about the world is almost never a nice, simple binary, it's true or it's false. And instead, we find that the deep truths of nature and man and God are they're just like a web of paradoxes. It's paradoxes all the way down. It's like when you find out in physics that atoms are not hard objects but are mostly empty space with a tiny minuscule particles inside them and a big electric force field of electrons whirling around the positive protons. And that means it's almost entirely empty. The ground is almost entirely empty that we're walking on. It's crazy. Well, Heraclitus says that's a nice start, but now I need to prepare you for the next step. And the next step is when it comes to what's true and what's not true. Likewise, it's paradoxes all the way down. You're gonna be that if you don't have an appetite for paradoxes, you better develop one. Granted, it's an acquired taste because nothing is as simple as we want it to be. Um, so what Stephen is bringing up here, a very important point, is that is your mind your own? Is your mind your own? And if it's not your own, has somebody committed a crime against you in putting something into your mind that you didn't agree to have there? And this is where we get into the whole point of this sentence that Kenneth has written here. Stephen has done that thing Stephen does, and he's touched the live wire at the center of this. Why does artificialism so much dominate our inner lives? And there's two answers. And the second answer is the one that people who are worried about their minds being colonized are concerned about. But the first answer makes the second answer harder to do something about. So the second answer, which I'll give first, is that, yeah, we're living in very artificial cultures. These are designed cultures. These are not evolved cultures. For 290,000 years, most human cultures were evolved cultures. People didn't even have the words to talk about what it is to have an ethos or a culture or any of these things. They just grew up however they grew up under the circumstances they grew up in. And the cultures, by process of elimination, either figured out how they and their people could survive within nature, in which case they became a viable culture, or they tried to live in some way that was absolutely in conflict with the specific nature where they were living, and then they went extinct and to be replaced by some other culture that figured it out. So there was this process of cultural evolution that happened for 290,000 years. And it's not that the results were optimized in any way, it's just that they were sustainable, right? Otherwise, we would have gone extinct. But once we started getting the idea that it was important to take voluntary control over the process of acculturation, the process of education, and so forth, we began to remove um, the grip of nature from that process and replace it with our abstract ideas about right and wrong, our ideas about what's healthy and what's not healthy. And that's a problem because our ideas aren't as authoritative as nature itself is. And it's possible to have a brilliant design, intricate, full of all kinds of great epiphanies, very exciting, everybody likes it, and you implement it and everybody dies. A good example is the Holocaust. I have this great idea. Purity. Purity leads to strength. Germany is weak after the war. We need to be strong. So we're going to purify our blood. We're going to go out. We're going to practice eugenics. We're going to get rid of all of the impurities that are damaging us. And the consequence is not that Germany becomes stronger. The consequence is that Germany commits a Holocaust and everybody hates Germany. And, we're going to teach about what they did until the end of time. Likewise, Stalin had brilliant ideas for what was going to happen in the Soviet Union. And his ideas resulted in tens of millions of deaths. Once
Well,
people.
they only did what you Americans did. Why are people so upset?
Oh, I know. Yeah, we had the same thing going on with our industrialized slavery and our designs for our societies and our genocide and so on. But see, this is
The cause of the Americans' War of Independence. The
yes.
issues. The British Crown had decided to create a large Indian reserve from the Appalachians to the Mississippi.
We weren't having it.
No, you weren't having it. And the other issue that came up was the Somerset case in England, where they established that chattel slavery wasn't legal.
We weren't having that either.
No, you're not
Yeah.
having that either.
Our glorious ideals that we fought the revolution for included very centrally genocide and slavery.
And taxation on tea was merely to support two regiments of redcoats to make sure you colonials didn't misbehave.
Yeah, we didn't care for that either.
Three issues.
Yes.
Damn the crown. I was taught by Walt Disney every Sunday that George III was the evilest man which ever existed in history. He
That's
wanted to
right.
protect Indians. He wanted to free slaves.
So
He
evil.
wanted to make sure you lot behaved yourselves.
Pay our taxes. No, we'd rather die. Yes. Give me genocide or give me death. So on the one hand, there is art for sure. These people concerned about colonization of their minds, they've got the thread of something important here, at least two important things. And so the second one is the one I just talked about first, which is, yeah, we do very artificially manufacture mass produce human personalities, and we don't do it according to what's good for our species or good for the individual. We do it according to our grand designs, which are often completely idiotic. It's insane. We've done an enormous amount of damage in the way that we've gone about these things. It's not to say that nobody should ever try to design an educational system. It's to say this is far more fraught with peril than we're ever willing to acknowledge. But now to get to the core of Stephen's point that he asked me to comment on, that's all just the setup. The first issue about the artificialism that dominates in their lives is that every other species has sophrosune. And that sophrosune is a compass in the brain that makes them pay attention to certain parts of their habitat and ignore others. And it makes them want to do certain things and not want to do others. And that combination of things that they notice and things that they want has been refined through empirical trial and error over billions of years to make a peregrine falcon, to make a salmon, so that the salmon smells its home stream. And after years far away in the ocean, it develops a longing to go home. And it can smell its way through the whole damn ocean, all the way back to the one tiny creek where it was born. We can't do that. I mean, not even other migratory animals, like Canada geese, they can't do it either. That is a salmon thing to do. And that's the result of their inner lives being shaped by nature into a very specific kind of inner life. That's sophrosune. Aristotle talks about this relentlessly, and the other Greek philosophers do too. And what they're saying is, man, if only we had that, but we don't. We are the one organism that doesn't have any of that. And the reason we don't have any of that is we are the one organism for which there isn't one right way to live. This is this we're evolution's new experiment in something that might not work out. Although we love ourselves and are sure this is the best possible thing, better than sliced bread, we don't actually have any basis for that, self-love. We are the only example of a species that lacks sophrosune. The advantage of lacking sophrosune is that when all those instinctual frames that frame a salmon to be a salmon, that frame a Canada goose to be a Canada goose, when that's all stripped away from our line of development, the result is an animal that is unfinished. And as a result, it could, in theory, live lots of different kinds of successful lives. And so we're the animal that is born, just like we can't hold our head up or stand up when we're born. We aren't coherent inside yet, and we have to be finished over the course of years by culture. And if a viable culture has figured out how to live as fishermen, in a fjord in Alaska under very difficult conditions, then they're going to raise their kids to fill in the blanks so that that child grows up to become a fisherman who can survive in that habitat. And that culture is the right culture for that place and that way of life. But it's completely different from the culture of, say, a reindeer herder among the Sami in Finland. It's a whole different set of values for working through the mountains, paying attention to your reindeer, taking care of them, and so forth. People don't have one right way of life. There are a lot of possible right ways of life. And therefore, that evolution had to get rid of the compass in the brain and trust that the cultures would fill in the blanks and make us finished animals. So there is a certain kind of artificialism, a naturalistic artificialism, or an artificial naturalism. We're talking paradox here. That our species is biologically determined to need to finish us. This is the paradox Stephen was talking about. Our inner lives have to be completed through culture because they sure aren't complete when we're born. And this is how we become lots of different animals that can live in lots of different habitats. And that it is because of that faculty that it was possible for recent cultures to replace naturalistic cultivation of human personalities with artificial cultivation of human personalities, not according to the way we've always lived in this fjord, but according to, I have this grand idea that we should all be intellectuals and study books. So that's what we're going to teach people to do, right? Or everybody now needs to know logic now. Everybody needs to know arithmetic. So we're going to send every last kid to school and they're all going to learn their math tables. That's not natural. That's a design. Someone had a design for us. But that design never could have been imposed. You can't teach math tables to a cheetah. It's not that there's no math in the world; it's that they don't care. They have sophrosune. It points to something else, right? But we don't have sophrosune, so you can raise us to point us to math tables, and next thing you know, we're all learning math. The artificialism. This is the paradox I'm trying to underscore in what Stephen asked about. The artificialism that predominates our lives now is possible because of the kind of animal that we are, which is that we're born unfinished and need to be completed by our culture. That had the Achilles heel, that the culture's completion didn't have to be a naturalistic completion. It could be an artificial completion. And that's how we live today. Donald, tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I was thinking maybe that artificialism was we talked years ago or months ago for sure about gnosis, that naive, immediate interaction with the world from for babies, or sometimes that in artificialism one has lost the ability for that gnosic experience of the world. We see only our constructions and no longer are capable of experience the unreconstructed world. You know that, and we thought at the time when we talked about gnosis, it was, it was sort of a trap we could fall into of too primitive an experience of the world, or too immediate. I'll say immediate, not, or unmediated experience of the world. And it's something you wanted to transcend, but I think it's also something that's essential that gets carried along to avoid this artificialism when all one has is constructs. Artificialism, or things are art, products of art, things that we make, so it's a made world, not nature at all, not a natural world, not an organism on its own. Well, that's enough.
Thank you, Donald. That's an important point, right? That part of what, if we are this animal that is born without sophrosune, but with a yearning for culture, an aching need inside of us to fill it with something, and how for 290,000 years did we avoid disaster? Why didn't we just imprint on stupid things and go extinct right away? And the answer is that until recently, we lived lives using Phil's Nature 1 and Nature 2 terminology. We lived lives in which there was very little Nature 2. and almost everything was nature one. And nature one is the realm in which phusis, or the cosmos, is constantly at our ear and at our eyes, pushing on us. Every time we try to do something stupid, the world slaps us. I mean, when you're in the wilderness, if you don't bring food, you're going to be in trouble pretty quickly. If you don't bring rain gear and it starts to rain, you're gonna get cold. You get feedback about your mistakes very quickly when you're immersed in nature one. But as Gilbert Murray says, and Kenneth loves this quote, one of the things that has happened through the development of our technological nature two habitats is that we have created a world in which it's easy for people who aren't paying any attention to survive fairly well. And the result of that is that vast numbers of people are no longer getting a quick feedback loop from nature about which of their ideas are stupid and which of their behaviors are destructive. And so people hang on to bad ideas and bad behaviors in nature too, far more easily and consistently than they ever did in nature one. And part of what that does is it lowers the priority of gnosis for us and raises the priority of noesis. You learn to cross with the green light and the walk sign. You learn to stop at the red light and the hand up sign. And none of that is natural. All of that's just an artificialism. And the more we invest in those artificialisms as our way of survival, the more we become detached from the gnosis that was offering, this is Donald's point, that was offering us the umbilical cord back to nature one and giving us our feedback. Oh, that burns my hand. I guess I shouldn't touch that. The less gnosis we have, the more we're likely to fill our heads full of noetic idiocy that has no basis in reality. And that's how a civilization drifts further and further away from something that's sustainable. It's a very good point. And I hadn't been thinking about that when we started talking. And thank you for bringing that up, Donald. It's very important. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So Sharon's trying to figure this out. And so I'm reading Steven Pinker's book, which is called The Blank Slate. And the major theme of the book is the idea that the human mind has no inherent structure and can be inscribed at will by society or ourselves. That's one part of it. So I think the animals, like the lion and the giraffe, they are born with a higher degree of instinct than us humans we ever are. But when I look at the way Kenneth Smith uses the word artificialism here, he says, we are not sure of how artificialism defines our inner lives. So I look up what that term means, and it was coined by Piaget, and it refers to the religiously oriented perspective that all things were created by an intelligent entity that has complete control over us. So now we're a blank slate, and society and culture is programming one part of it. And then there's this religious side of it, which also comes from the culture, I think, right? Which is responsible for what we think. So I'm trying to meld those two things together. And I don't know if I'm making sense, but it's a little confusing at this point.
You are.
Thank you.
There's several important things in what you're saying. Let's start with Steven Pinker and the blank slate. Tabula rasa is the Latin, and it is one of the classic models of the human mind. It's what I was taught when I was little. I was born in '66. My dad was into science and math, so I just from a very young age I was exposed to basic theories about how people work. And the tabula rasa idea is the blank slate idea. And it's what you summarized from Pinker. The idea is we have no inner nature at all. And we are entirely constructed based on how we're educated and raised by our culture. That was where we were in the middle of the 20th century. And that was the basis for behaviorism as a subset of psychology. It was the dominant school and a radical behaviorism. Because after all, if we have no inner nature, then it's not possible to commit a crime against us in the process of educating us. There's no right or wrong. It's just whatever we want to make people be, we just make them be that. And so this idea of operant conditioning, like Pavlov and the bell and the dogs that salivate, the idea was that we can make people into whatever design we have in mind for them. And so we have an obligation to do that. We should come up with our design for what human beings are like, and then we will educate the shit out of them until that's exactly what they're like. And what we discovered is the tabula rasa is not true. It's an oversimplification. And we've spent the last 60 years since then retreating from the strict tabula rasa position. Even though he wrote this book in 2002, he's describing where we were in the middle of the 20th century, and we aren't there anymore. People are increasingly coming to understand that there are parts of your character that you're born with. Like, I'm an alcoholic. I was born with that. I don't ever have to take a drink of alcohol in my entire life. I don't learn this from anybody. I've got the gene. I don't dare drink because I know it'll happen, because every member of my family going back generations on all sides, they all spent time in the bottle. That is a refutation of the tabula rasa. It says that there are things in your character that you are born with. And so the more nuanced position that we're moving towards and when it comes to the human being is that we're not exactly tabula rasa, but we certainly have a lot less written on our inner slate than a giraffe does. The giraffe has more instincts than we have, but we still have some. And some of the instincts are going to be counterproductive, like to crawl into a bottle in the case of an alcoholic, but some of them are very productive. Like, people are born with an instinct to orient towards faces. It's genetic in us. And it's because the baby has to learn everything from its parents, and it needs to turn and face the parents and watch how they talk, watch how they make expressions, read their body language. It's part of the process of becoming a person. You have to be fascinated by people. And it's why people will look at a photograph of a rock formation on Mars and go, look, there's a face. There must be Martians, and they made a face. So we can see faces in clouds. We can see faces in pancakes. We can see faces anywhere. A grease smear on the wall. Oh my God, it's Jesus. No, that's your brain doing the instinctive thing, which is you were born with an urge to see faces. It's part of our instincts. Another one that is widely acknowledged to be an instinct is we have an instinct for language. We are mimetic creatures. We really want to imitate. You see this when people play that little game where it's like, okay, make a sound like a duck. Whack, 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 whack. Okay, now make a sound like a dog. And how about a cat? Give me your best cat. Everybody sort of gets this little charge, or can you talk like Spock or Kermit the Frog or Miss Piggy? Can you do impersonations? Get down to that instinctual thing in us that drives the desire to acquire language. Our parents are looking at us, we're looking at them, we're riveted by their faces, and they're making all these sounds, and we just kind of instinctively want to mimic the sounds that we're hearing. We want to do it too. And that desire to do it has its own track of motivation separate from the desire to understand and communicate. Those are separate tracks. And eventually they come together and we have language. But the babbling phase of little kids, when they're just learning to produce the phonemes for their own language that their parents speak, that's instinctual, right? Other animals don't do it that way. They have different instincts. So what's happened in us, which is sort of modifying Pinker's theory here, is that specific instincts like, oh my God, the gazelle is so pretty. I need the gazelle. Please, 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 Mr. Gazelle, let me catch you. Right? Cheetahs have these very specific instincts. Or the salmon, I need to go home. I have to go home. When I get to a certain age, it's time to go home. And those things are gone in us, except for faces. And they're largely replaced with abstract instincts, like the instinct to imitate, to be mimetic for its own sake. And the combination of abstract instincts that we have in us is what drives our acquisition of culture and completing our ethos from our parents, from our family members, our neighbors, our friends. We're filling in the blanks because together, these various abstract instincts, most of which we haven't cataloged yet, because we're still trying to understand what we are and we don't know what to look for. but together they sort of drive that, what you might call a meta instinct for culture. We're the animal that needs to finish itself, as Pico della Mirandola put it. We need it. We want it. We don't know that that's what we're doing, but we imprint in the same way that ducklings will imprint on you and follow you around. I don't know if you guys have seen the film Fly Away Home with Anna Paquin, directed by Carol Ballard, about the little girl who finds a nest of Canada geese. The mother fled, and so she has to raise the eggs herself. And of course, as anyone who's ever dealt with bird psychology is not surprised to discover, all of these little goslings imprint on her immediately, and they want to follow her everywhere. She's not allowed to go anywhere without this herd of geese following along behind her, running as fast as they can, cheeping, slow down, mama, slow down. Well, we aren't exactly geese, but we sort of imprint on our culture, and we come to take it for granted as being a health-giving thing that we need to learn about and imitate. That and whether there's probably not a specific instinct for that in us, the way that geese do have a specific instinct for imprinting. It's probably the result of 4 or 5 or 6 different instincts in us that together add up to this meta instinct for culture. So, but there is, despite the fact that I would, offer these clarifications of the blank slate idea in the years since it was at its heyday, nevertheless, he's certainly barking up the right tree, because there's no doubt that we are more programmable, finishable, I don't know what the right terminology is, than any other animal. But it's not zero. It's not that we've got nothing, the way the blank slate suggests. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was going to say, if we're talking about medieval models, of course, of life, we can do no better than Monty Python and the Holy Grail. We've got, the guy, Chapman was his name, he plays King Arthur, and of course he comes up to modern thoughts in the anarchist collective. And there's a different interpretation of the world going on. As a peasant says, "Well, who made you king?" "Oh, well, the lady of the lake lifted up her arm out of the lake in the purest shimmering sunlight and held aloft the sword Excalibur, meaning I'm king." Of course, the peasant has a different interpretation on that, and in the end, King Arthur is, shaking him because he's been given a set of concepts that just don't fit in with the way he does things.
I love that so much. It's one of my favorite scenes. Just because some watery bit lobs a scimitar at you, that's no basis for a government.
System of government, yeah. Well, there's the other bit, of course, where he fights the knight and cuts his legs and arms off. And when he's cut one arm off, the first thing Arthur does is put his sword down on the ground like a cross and start praying to God. Even in the, as soon as you've gone past the danger, the first thing you must do is pray to God. And you read, this medieval stuff, and the good guys and the bad guys are often quite serious about their belief in God and their place in that entire system. Another thing I'm going to say, I read Hrafnhildi's saga, which was one of those Icelandic sagas, rather interesting. They don't tend to notice this, but, people talk about the colonization of Iceland. The first guy that went there tried to live there and just about starved to death and went back home. And eventually one guy's, various reasons, they have to escape from Norway, so being thrown out of town, so he goes over there, he can't go back. And he's the first person to start living there, but that's about 870 AD. And it's really about 50 years later that the place is, becoming quite a thing. And they found the Icelandic Commonwealth. But it's missing in all the description, people are talking about this and talking about it. And it's like they've got this picture that the guy just jumps down and instantly creates a farm and everything's going fantastic. And you read in between the lines, and that wasn't happening. It took them about 50 years to understand how to live in the place. And when they had established that understanding, hordes of people started coming from Norway. You know, some people had claimed huge tracts of land. Somebody came along and he said, here you are, I'll give you this tract of land as long as you understand that I'm the big guy in the valley. And of course, the big guy in the valley is the one that knows how to do stuff, how to survive in this environment. So naturally, they're going to follow him. Now he's got a lot of followers, and makes you feel good when you get up in the morning, you've got a load of followers. But the interesting thing is when you read those Icelandic sagas is what you pick up. You pick up that same sort of taciturn, laconic sort of persona, which typified, say, the people that in Westerns. Yeah, it's Northern Europeans have that very sort of laconic personality. And they are the ones which had a particular ability to live in virgin land. You know, they go over and colonize a place from the start. You look at the Chinese. There was Siberia there. The Russians come along and take it over, much to the chagrin of the Chinese. Chinese were there for thousands of years. Somehow the idea of going to a really marginal place like Siberia and making it work just wasn't on their agenda. One of the things that is very different about Europe from places like India and China and Egypt is that these great river civilizations, which generally have better, longer growing seasons and that, will deliver a surplus much more easily. The trouble with Europe is you can make it work, but to work a surplus from it is a lot more difficult. Like there's a high dependence on iron tools. And when iron became scarce at the end of the Roman Empire, the place became primitive again for a while until they started discovering other sources of iron. Europeans needed iron tools to make their environment work. Hence, in the Middle Ages, it was Europeans that came up with the oxygen-controlled blast furnace. They were the first ones that could build the blast furnace, which would produce predictable quality pig iron on the larger scale, because they needed the iron to make the place work. But that thing with the Icelanders, 50 years to discover how to make the place work. You just don't, people have this picture of, when people colonize places, that it's just straight away success story. Some guy comes along, somebody else has built a log cabin, and, in the movie, it's got a note on it saying, you can have it. I'm out of this crazy place. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, part of what you're underscoring is the relationship between ethos and culture, right? If you're going to live in these marginal places, you had better have a culture that reveres iron and the working of iron. It's not a coincidence that the ancient Greeks, one of their 12 divinities, I mean, they had plenty of divinities beyond the 12, but the top rank, the 12, it includes Hephaestus. So you have better be good with metalworking, or you are just the whole way of life isn't going to work that they had in mind. Their ancestors had come from the steppes between the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, north of the Caucasus Mountains, and they'd already traveled through Central Europe before they came south into the Hellenic Peninsula. And by the time they got there, they absolutely understood, metalworking. Without metalworking, we aren't even a people. And so it became part of their ethos, and it became one of the paths that a certain percentage of Greeks would be raised to become a metalworker. That specific bios or way of life, was one of the ways in which they acculturated their young. And it wasn't because somebody had a grand design, like everybody should learn arithmetic. It was because they couldn't make it without metalworking. And that's when we talk about the idea of the difference between these naturalistic evolved cultures versus these highly artificial cultures like ours. This is part of the difference that we mean. They didn't sit around with a bunch of diagrams and formulas and theories about, they weren't doing Plato's Republic saying what would the ideal republic look like. They were like, hammered on. Their ancestors were hammered on by nature until they figured out it's if we're going to make it, some of us have to really, really care about metalworking. And that's so they were nature made them that way. Later, as they shifted from a mythos culture to a logos culture, they became more artificial, more deliberate in their designs. But that was piggybacking upon um, the earlier naturalistic culture. And it's one of the things that's interesting is you see that artificializing cultures are at their most successful when they're only one or two generations removed from a very naturalistic culture. Because the naturalistic culture is getting a lot of things right. I mean, they evolved and they wouldn't be there if they weren't getting a lot of things right. And so you can make a certain number of experiments by design, and some of them will fail and some of them will succeed. But even if they fail, the rest of the culture is still coherent. We're in the opposite condition. We've thousands of years of artificializing, have produced the modern nation state. And the result is when we make mistakes, they tend to go really bad because we are so far away from any kind of sustainable naturalistic culture. But we'll come back to that. But of course, again, part of what it means is we deliberately raise people not in a way that is normal or natural or healthy for them, but according to our theories of what people should be like. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I think let's speak to this directly, but I'm gonna go back in time and reference something our favorite word, sophrosyne, and this artificiality of humans and how you said something that cued me into something, and I'm gonna try and throw a wrench in the current sophrosyne equation that we think works so well. I'm gonna throw in a paradox that we all know we're supposed to see paradoxes. This is a paradox that's messing with me. So here we go. When a when a baby is born or developing in the womb, there's a couple of counterintuitive things that happen that only make sense if you understand like this whole biology stuff. First one is massive neuron cell death. Starts like 7 months or 6 months into the pregnancy. Massive amounts of neurons. Aptos, thank you. Yeah, massive amounts of, but specifically in neurons. Like again, it's like purposely overgrown and they're cold. Then what happens is once the neurons themselves are cleaned up and there's a lot of housekeeping, the commissures, the synapses between them are apparently we spend our whole life cutting them and strengthening the ones that are remained. That's kind of like the whole purpose of REM sleep. But there's something interesting that neuroscientists have hypothesized that's a really interesting, almost like parable that, and I want to let you almost see, you're going to figure out on your own how you want to associate this lesson that neuroscience is teaching and how it affects sophrosyne. It goes like this: that work of David Eagleman talking with Andrew Huberman about how if you blindfold a person for essentially an ultradian cycle, 90 minutes, so they can't use their optic nerves at all, and you give them lots of essentially things to do with their body and their ears, essentially like have to go through a maze, but blindfolded, and they're using their physical sensory touch, their motor cortex and their sensory cortexes, physical touch to navigate, and also their ears. The point of this is after 90 minutes, keeping the person blind, after just 90 minutes, there is activity of the other cortexes, specifically the auditory and the touch, in the visual cortex. Those things are already trying to take over the visual cortex, right? They're already moving in. These are competitive ecosystems that are a team of rivals that are fighting against each other. And it's something like the prefrontal cortex is like a king that unites a team of rivals. But they're really, again, much more accurate is creatures in an ecosystem. These are all ecosystems that are grouping up and they're competing. and they're growing in, they're taking over the territory. When you call it war or whatever, but it's like, you know, if you think of a person who's the seeing person and they leave their house for a little while, you know, the other guys are taking over that, squatting in that territory real fast. 60 to 90 minutes, not even sleep. And it's this idea, he says specifically because of this, what's happening during sleep time, the reason we need to see things and things are slamming into the optical cortex is it keeps that other stuff out. And it's literally why we do this every 60 to 90 minutes. It keeps the other stuff out. And essentially it's keeping these places from getting not interconnected with other types of ecosystems. So when nature decided to simply do something new with us and remove our sophrosyne, it's a lot like cutting the commissures of a synapse that's overgrown, right? This is now because, and the idea of, it's said here, but through, of all places, Jonathan Sachs, but I think it's a neuroscience idea, is the meaning, but also you could call it the function of a system is only derived outside of the system, which means you have to have it separate. So in order to give the red-green thing that we drive by, it's separate, it can't interfere with our normal cues. It can't be like red and green feels like sugar or like pain or like anything, right? It has to be completely distinct and it has to mean its own abstract thing. And that's the idea of abstraction. It's completely separate. And that's that separateness that also prevents it from governing any of our systems, like our movement directly. The prefrontal cortex is a completely separate, abstracted system. So now we're saying that there's a value to not having sophrosyne, essentially, because you're removed from your natural cues. What it did is you're saying the same thing that I am, but in a different way. That gives the system a tremendous amount of plasticity. It's like if our sophrosyne were one thing and we characterize our people and our brains, like I don't think this happens to deer. If you take away their sight for 90 minutes, their optical cortex does not start growing in. I mean, the vice versa. You get it what I'm saying. Their auditory cortex doesn't start taking over their optical cortex so fast. Human beings are the neuroplasticity people. And the strangest thing is, even in people we say that are old and whatever, they're supposed to have no neuroplasticity. Their neuroplasticity is tremendous. It just hurts usually, right? It's just tremendous, but it hurts. And that's the interesting thing, you know, but going back to this process of going from a young person to an old person, a young person has all these connections that are grown everywhere. And the whole process is sort of separating them and strengthening them and then keeping them separate. And then essentially when they're separate, then they can have this paradoxical conjugate relationship with each other where they have essentially dialectics. But you can't have dialectics without that separateness. So it's weird. It's like, is the trade-off, we went from a sophrosyne organism to a dialectic type of organism, which removes a certain element of sophrosyne, which then it makes certain things really worse. The last thing I want to end with is this thing about what's the problem with artificial stuff is sometimes it's really good, but sometimes it's really bad. And I think specifically, again, ironically, this is where sophrosyne, where it's incomplete, is actually quite dangerous, which is the classic supernormal stimula. People attracted to the wrong things for the wrong reasons, having no idea why. The classic example in nature that they also don't have perfect sophrosyne is if you put the red stick in a bird's nest, they feed the red stick instead of their babies, and the babies die, right? So this isn't perfect sophrosyne either, but they haven't abstracted from their environment in a way where they get red sticks, right? This doesn't happen. It's not their problem. For us, we've abstracted from our environment so much, we've filled it with red sticks, and it seems like some people are using those red sticks specifically to domesticate other people. And this seems to be like what's really going on, right? This is man is a wolf to man. This is weird stuff. This is like you start with all these plastic stem cells, and they're trying to emerge a hierarchical organism of a brain and a toenail cell. And it's like, I don't want to be the toenail cell that gets clipped. I want to be the neuron cell that gets to make all decisions and never dies, right? I want to feel important. So anyways, it seems to be like humanity's doing that, representing this fractal sort of thing. But again, one of the things that's really weirdly key in this that we go back to is this necessity between cooperation and competition, like we saw in the brain, and it's almost like sophrosyne is taking the gloves off on certain types of competition almost. So there's less cooperation, but it's weird that you can't have cooperation without competition, and vice versa, right? You can't have any of these things without the other. It's a weird form of dialectic. And again, I think the key here that I relate to, that I think really relates to Kenneth's work, to maybe get us back to Kenneth, is talking about how humanity is by design an immature species, and we're trying to grow up. And it's pretty much a simple proposition, I think, at this point, especially where shit is hitting the fan with ecosystems devastation and like all the things you're talking about. It's pretty much get off the pot, poop or get off the pot, right? Grow
Yep.
up or die. We
Yep.
need to grow up, and we're incomplete. So I would say maybe that this is all causing us to figure shit out.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Ari. That's brilliant. And it really, you're providing part of the neuroanatomical and physiological basis for what is it that evolution had in mind for us. Granted, nothing is purposeful in evolution. It's hard to talk about teleology without talking about purpose, but the Greek concept of teleology doesn't require purpose. It can be goal-oriented and functional without a brain deciding anything. So we can abstractly say that what evolution had in mind for us is not just, we're going to strip away these safety nets and then chuck you into the world and good luck. The whole thing you're talking about neuroplasticity and how it functions in Homo sapiens, that goes hand in hand with stripping out Sophrosune. Because the Sophrosune is stripped out, because the framing is stripped out, that creates the possibility for this incredible neuroplasticity. And the neuroplasticity is the point, to make an animal that can grow up to be lots of different kinds of animals, which hasn't happened before. That we're new, right? We're a new thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to say one last thing. If we're going to go back to this whole narrative language, which is weak and messy, I think the best narrative language that I would like to use is something more like nature is like hypothesizing. What if I do this? What will happen? Right? So it's experimenting all the time. So this is some sort of grand experiment that it's invested a lot of
Yeah.
of action, time, and energy into to see what happens. We're doing a lot of stuff. I'll give it that. If our goal is just to do stuff, human beings are amazing. We do lots of stuff. And maybe,
Yes.
to be honest, to give us fair credit, to take all the pressure off us, like we're supposed to be in charge and we're supposed to be God's agents and all this stuff, maybe we just be like, we're living beings and we're supposed to do stuff. Well, if that's the measure, well done, sir.
Yes, that's right. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I want to thank Ari. That was really insightful. And it especially helped me with the Gnothe Seauton, because I'm from the town of Red Stick, that is Baton Rouge in French, and that just explains so much. I've been feeding that red stick for all my life. I'll get back to my true children soon.
Yes. And the other critical thing that Ari said that's really important here is to understand, Sophrosune isn't like a superpower. It can go horribly awry, but the reason it doesn't is because it develops within a specific habitat that has specific characteristics. There are things that are in that habitat, and there are many more things that are absolutely not in that habitat. There aren't any red sticks. And so as a result, the bird can't be tricked into the mistake of feeding the stick instead of its chick. And that's how Sophrosune is. It's conditional. Contingency in agency versus the agency of the bird makes sense within the contingency of its habitat. That's what makes it fly. And if we fuck with that habitat and replace nature one with nature two, we have no idea how many situations like the bird with the red stick we're going to generate and screw up, because we don't know how any of this works. We're just out there doing stuff and crossing our fingers and hoping that it works out. So I'm going to take us on a little. Oh, Sharon, come off mute.
Well, where does experience come in all of this?
Yes. Well, that's where the neuroplasticity comes into play, right? Because our experiences reshape our brain, and then the reshaped brain now has new concerns and new things it notices that it didn't before.
So Sophrosune is an evolving concept or evolving behavior then.
Yeah, even in an animal like a salmon that has enormous numbers of instincts at work, still it all gets shaped by experience to a profound extent. We have the same thing going on in us, but just without the compass to give us any guidance.
So you can use the red stick to feed the children, but if the children are hungry, then you learn.
Yes. Yes.
I don't know if this is too simplistic, but this is what I'm trying to get from it.
Yeah, this is a thing we're gonna be digging. We've been talking about Sofer Sune ever since we were in the ancient section, and we're gonna keep talking about it all the way to the end of this book and beyond, because it's not simple. And in fact, I'm about to complicate it just one more touch to add one more little bow on what we've all been talking about on this before we go on, and that is, it's not that we have nothing. Other species have Sofer Sune, and what we have is enthusiasm. Where that's the neuroplasticity makes us addicted to different things at different times under different conditions. And those addictions, and I'm not just talking about negative addictions, but also positive addictions, they function analogously to sofrosune, even though they're not sofrosune. And so if you're raised in a healthy culture, you can develop an enthusiasm for tying knots. If you're a fisherman, you work on boats, you better tie knots really well. You better know the difference between a knot that is the right one to hold in a storm and the one that's like it but won't hold in a storm. If you can't tell the difference between them, you're going to die at sea, right? Something the knot's going to come loose, the tiller's going to fly over, hit you in the head, knock you in the water, you're dead. So the ones who thrive develop that appetite for knots and knot work, and they become excellent at it, and they just think it's great. They just can't get enough of the knot work, and they can't get enough of it because if they could get enough, they'd be dead. It is the substitute for sofrosune in them, that cultural enthusiasm that has been learned, and that's all being driven by the kind of neuroplasticity that you're asking about and that Ari was talking about. So, with this as the background, that puts us in a position now to talk through the significance of what Kenneth wrote here. Um, and I'm going to do it using a bunch of quotes that Kenneth likes, and also by using some Kenneth quotes you guys haven't seen before. We'll see how far we get today. But the first thing that's really critical to understand, this is a subtext of that first sentence of paragraph 3, is this. It's that moderns have an astonishing level of hubris in that we are confident that we can say what human nature is. And we can say what is natural or healthy for human beings. We do it all the time. And we do it because part of our enthusiasm is the belief that we should be designing everything consciously, that nothing is any good until we design it. Until we get in there and mess with it, it's not okay. As the sarcastic saying about film producers go, a film producer is a man who thinks that if someone hands you just the finest bottle of wine you've ever seen, it's still no good until you piss in it. Once you've pissed in it, it becomes a great wine. But before that, it's just crap. It is your tampering that imbues greatness upon a film. And it is directors who say this about producers. And it is in a nutshell the summation of which German philosopher? I'll come back to that later, Stephen. It is the summation of what it means to be modern, that we have turned the artificialism up to 11. That we took Socrates as the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being, and we turned it into a mania. We want to examine everything. We want to question everything. We want to pull everything to pieces and then only put some of it back together and forget about the other parts and then move on to the next thing that we're going to disassemble. It's fundamental to our mode. And so Kenneth talks about modern culture as a kind of anti-culture. It's a kind of acid bath. And when people from more traditional cultures are dropped into, for example, the United States, maybe in the first generation they hang on to their language and their religion and their mores. But by the second generation, their kids are rebelling against them and wanting to throw away their past and become Americans. And they want to fit in. And that urge to fit in eats away at all the traditional values, including the ones that were healthy, including the values that were making it possible for those people from that other culture to live better than we live in America. But their kids have this yearning to fit in that eats away at those healthy traditions and tears them to pieces in a kind of acid bath. So we live in a hyper artificial habitat. Our cultures, our psyches, the nature too, the world that we've rebuilt around us. And the consequence is that it's insane that we think we know what human nature is, that we think we know what's natural or healthy, when nobody has ever been as artificial as we are. When we look around ourselves, all the examples that we're trying to generalize from about what people are like are examples of hyper unnatural people, including ourselves. So we're generalizing. We're making claims to know about life in vivo when we've never left the laboratory, and the only examples we have are of life in vitro. And we think the laboratory conditions are the natural conditions. We think that the milk does come from the store and that chocolate milk must come from brown cows. We are really disconnected from the basics of life. It's part of why I was raised to go hiking and camping. You know, I have some Norwegian and Swedish and Finnish in my ancestry, and in Norway, everybody who has a house in the city also has a cabin in the woods. And when the weekend comes, people just run to their cars and drive away, and they go stay in their cabin because it is part of the old culture in Norway that you don't know what life is unless you've got one foot still in the wilderness, so that the trees and the creeks and the mountains can remind you what's real. Um, and so it put me in a position growing up to be receptive to the idea that in living in this nature too that we've constructed, we really do not understand how things work or who we are or what the hell's going on. So when Kenneth talks about this stuff, this part, there are parts in Kenneth that were very hard for me to get. This was a part that was very easy for me to get. So, you know, human beings in the 300,000 year history of our species, you know, none of them were ever more disconnected from nature and health than we are now. None of them had a nature two that was as radically different from nature one as what we have. And so when he says, going back now to the end of sentence one of paragraph 3, when he says, what's hard for us to comprehend is the extent of the artificialism that dominates our inner lives. This is part of what he's talking about. We are just so, anybody else would have had more of an advantage in trying to figure out what a natural person might have been like. So it means that more than any other thing, we do not know what we are or what we could be. Because instead of being grown, we've been created in a laboratory. Our whole world has been turned into a giant artificial laboratory. We don't know what things would normally be like, naturally be like outside of this. And because of that, we take the artificial conditions we're in to be natural. We think this is natural. And we try to generalize from here. And this is no basis for understanding what's possible, because the artifice that we're living in, it cuts off certain possibilities that if we'd grown up in a more natural matrix, those possibilities would have been obvious to us. But from where we are, they seem impossible. It's like all the people born into the United States today who think that it's impossible that the United States could ever have a public health system. And they're too young. They don't know what a lot of us on this call know because we lived through the public health service having hospitals and clinics all over the United States. We used to have a public health service in this country. Not only is it possible, it existed. We know it existed because we were there. And the country doctor gave me my early vaccinations. That was PHS. But Nixon shut all that down out of corruption, because he was bestest buddies with the founder of Kaiser Permanente. And the founder of Kaiser Permanente said, it's frustrating that all these people can get health care for cheap. If you would just shut down all those public health service hospitals, they would be forced to come to my Kaiser Permanente hospitals and pay me money. And Nixon said, you got it, buddy. And he shut down all the PHS hospitals. And now all these poor people had to pay a greater percentage of their income to be able to afford basic health care because there wasn't a public health system. So today you see all these politicians who say it is a radical leftist idea that the United States could ever have a public health service. But we did have a public health service. We already had it. We are so artificial now compared to where we were before Nixon did that we think things that actually existed could never possibly exist. That's how out of the world our minds are when we live in an artificial environment. That's what it means to be artificial. And what's weird is not only are we completely disconnected from what's real, not only do we have no idea what we are, what we could be, we're sure that we do know who we are and what we could be. Our ignorance is combined with confidence. This is what is that law about the less you know, the more you think you know, and the more you learn to be humble about what you know, because you understand how much more there is that you don't know. And I don't know if you guys have seen those diagrams. The memes go around sometimes, and there's this stage called Mount Stupid, where you know a little bit, but you think you know everything. But then when you learn a little bit more, your confidence begins to ebb as you discover, oh no, I apparently don't know much. Stephen, come off mute. Tell me what's on your mind.
Yes, I recall the public health system when I was a kid. And, well, I got knocked over by a car, so I went to a small local hospital and experienced it. I would say the problem is why it doesn't work. And actually, you put your finger on it, but not quite enough. Is that in the old days, people went to things like church. They believed in being honest. They believed in public service. They believed in not trying to screw everything for the last red cent. They were content. As Jesus said, be content with your wages and don't screw anybody. Our culture has changed. The medical services became more and more, how can I get more money out of this? It became not so much the spirit of charity. The health system came from charity. It came from the monasteries. It came from the church. They weren't doing it for a profit in this world. They're looking for profit in the next world. Today, we're looking for profit in this world. And still, like in Australia, and I imagine the statistics would be the same, 1/6 of the entire workforce is connected with the health system, whether it's public or private. That's a huge amount. If you had to start fighting a war, if you had to start putting people into roles to supply a war effort, a lot of that's going to have to go. Unless you could build robots, which I don't believe. I haven't seen. I keep on getting told by people that the robots are on the way. I still haven't seen free CPA rock up at my door trying to sell me encyclopedias. It hasn't happened. But, people watch these YouTube things, and I try to point out that this is all set up. They're selling you an idea that if you invest with us, this will be your future, but they're really just eating your lunch. We're living in a different world. We used to have a relatively above board, honest world, but now everything is becoming a scam. So will your public health system work in a world where everyone wants to screw everything, where everything is a scam? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Absolutely. And part of how all of this manifests itself is that when we have been highly artificialized, we come to believe that the artificial thing we are is natural, and we resist any understanding of how artificial we've become. It turns into rather than taking an interest in the possibility that we're artificial, we get offended and we want to fight. Like, how dare you say that I'm not the thing that I believe I am? So there's this tension in modernity, reality versus brand. Reality versus brand. And it's one of the most central tensions. I wouldn't call it a dialectic, I'd call it a direct contradiction in the structure of our minds and our institutions, where we fall in love with the brands And then we insist that the reality must actually conform with the brand, even when it doesn't. And the classic example is the Princeton study from 25 years ago that shows that we don't have a functioning democracy in the United States. Australia, France, UK, all of them have far more functioning democracies than we do, because in the United States, it's really just a oligarchy, and specifically it's a plutocracy. And their study of legislation and who proposed it and what passed said the evidence is overwhelming that the ultra rich in the United States more or less always get the legislation changes that they want. And whenever people who do not have a lot of money want legislation changes to happen, they more or less never happen. Unless the entire country rises up in a dangerous way. That's the only time you get like the 40-hour work week in the United States. And the rest of the time, it just whittles away and whittles away and whittles away, which is why in the IRS, they have, big divisions that are focused on chasing down tax frauds who are poor. But the division that's responsible for chasing down tax frauds among the rich is grossly underfunded, always perpetually, because the rich are always buying off legislators to cut off funding for that branch. They don't want that part of the tax enforcement to be working effectively. So reality versus brand is this huge problem for us. And you see it with this issue of artifice. Our self-image is how we get hired. Our brand is how we get hired. Enormous numbers of people lie on their CVs and resumes, and they promote a brand of themselves that's able to do more things than they actually are. And they do that so that they can get hired, to get the job, to learn to do the thing that they claim they already know how to do. And then they hopefully will turn their brand into a reality and then come up with at least in IT, this is like the norm. People are constantly chasing from one job to the next based on what's the next language that I need to learn? What's the next operating system I need to learn? What's the next cool thing? And I don't know it yet. I read a book about it and I did it for, a week. And now I'm going to stick it on my resume and try to land a job where I can practice it and get paid to practice it and then improve my resume. Resume improvement as a mode of life. This is a brand-based lifestyle instead of a reality-based lifestyle. And it really has become the norm for us and our institutions. And the result is that we have a similar problem to what a practicing alcoholic has. Because a practicing alcoholic in the modern world, his brand is that he's not a drunk. Absolutely not. Because he can hold his liquor. Look how many bottles of whiskey I can chuck back. I'm obviously not an alcoholic because I can go through 6 bottles a day. It's those people who can't hold their liquor. They're the problems. They're the ones with the problem. But the fact that my garbage can is full of bottles all the way to the top every week, that's only evidence that I'm not an alcoholic. And this is how an alcoholic gets stuck. Reinterpret with his enthusiasms, his interpretive framework in his mind, his brand versus reality structure, he's able to completely invert the truth for himself. And what he's doing is not specific to an alcoholic, although it's very well documented in alcoholic psychology. What he's doing is just a manifestation of what we all do in our lives. We want to be hireable. We want to be attractive to employers. We want to be attractive to potential mates or spouses. We want to be seen as or believed to be something cool, whether we are or not. In abusive families, it's why there's a code of silence that's enforced so hard. Yeah, daddy may be beating up on the kids, but the kids are not allowed to say so. Everybody has to cooperate in maintaining the lie that none of this is happening. Brand versus reality. Very modern things to do. So using that, if we didn't want to be so artificial in our inner lives, I'm gonna explore the problem. This is all using Kenneth Smith stuff. I'm going to explore the problem and also talk a little bit about what would be required to get out of it. Kenneth Smith's not just a doomsayer. He's anatomizing these issues so that we can understand the nature of the trap we're caught in, and that will help us to understand how to get out of it. So, what are some well-known sayings about recovery from a serious problem? Well, the first step to recovery is admitting we have a problem. Sometimes people say admitting you have a problem is half the battle, not just the first step. And it's because of this issue of branding. when we are so committed, when we have poured our self-esteem and self-identity so much into the brand and not the reality, it makes us extremely reluctant to tell the truth. We become addicted to the lies. Kenneth Smith calls it pseudophilia. Moderns are pseudophiliacs. We are obsessed with fantasies, escapism, lies, brands, propaganda, anything except the ugly truth. We don't want to talk about that part. And we consider it, if someone tries to get us to tell the truth, we react as though they're coming at us like trying to stick a fork in our eye. I mean, we hyper react. We see it as a massive threat. And of course, this particular quote about the first step to recovery is an adaptation from Alcoholics Anonymous. And Narcotics Anonymous adapted as well. We admitted we were powerless over our addiction, that our lives had become unmanageable. And this is where people get the fallacy that you have to hit bottom before you can start to get better. Your life has to become so unmanageable that you can't maintain your brand anymore. And when your brand collapses and there's nobody to punch for threatening your brand, yeah, Nietzsche. That's right, Stephen. Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the clearest German philosopher to directly analyze Sophrosyne as a virtue. Yeah, yeah. So it's when there's nobody to blame for sabotaging our brand and forcing us to admit the reality that we finally start to make our lives better. So, for example, a lot of U.S. citizens are looking around at what's going on right now, going, none of this makes sense according to my old model of what America is and what our politics are and how we're all nice and we're the best and we're the most modern and we have all these checks and balances. Rick's AI replacement. Yeah, it's only a matter of time, isn't it? And then Elizabeth Gilbert has a quote here. This is not one that Kenneth has done. I came up with this weekend. I've never seen any life transformation that didn't begin with the person in question finally getting tired of their own bullshit. Right? We have to fall out of love with our brand enough to give the reality a chance. That the bullshit of the brand and all the bullshit that it's covering up, that what we've swept under that rug, we have to get to a point where we're just sick of it before we're willing to make the change to admit that there needs to be changes. And this is where moderns are when it comes to artificialism. What does it take to get us to recognize and admit that a whole bunch of what's inside of us isn't even us, that it's fake, that we've been constructed. And that the constructions, Stephen alluded earlier to how in earlier generations there was older traditional morality and values that were being injected into people along with the artificialities of school. But as the 20th century progressed and we got more methodical and scientific and technological in our approaches to education, we were able to purge those traditional values and replace them with the ones that we designed, i.e., that had no basis in reality. And the more we did that, the more we created a circumstance in which it got harder and harder for us to figure out that we had a problem. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'll try not to be too much of a dead horse with neuroscience, but I'm hearing some really good stuff here. That essentially it's like this, that we have, I'm going to make a purposely false dichotomy, but it's a really good dichotomy. It's a good, useful model, that we have two competing ecosystems of circuitry in our brain. I've already introduced that. One is the future and controlling and predicting. And usually it's associated with abstraction, like for whatever reasoning, and that type of symbolic representation is really used in these circuits. Again, that abstraction, the green-reds thing. And again, the idea is to create a certain increase in what we call signal-to-noise ratio, predictive power, right? So long as it explains, your model is explanatory using these weird abstractions, it works great. So what happens is when predictive power fails, you'd think that a healthy system would then, what I'd call an adult would then take a new principle and adapt to its needs and then reweight everything. So what happens, you're talking about this addictive stuff. Why is there addiction? What is there a biological reason even to be addicted? And there's something about, it has to do with investment and leveraging. I look at, we've essentially invested and leveraged for our lives in these predictive abstractional circuits that are really well developed. And now we've made it the hammer that has to work on every nail. And the problem is that our circuits also, the signatures gets nice, that's really the observable for us in the human world, not in the cellular world, is the feeling of dopamine. Dopamine is the reward associated with the modeling. So when your model is doing really good, you need dopamine. And this is why we're all hyper dopaminergic. It's not that we're actually so much addicted to dopamine, I think. It's they're really addicted to prediction and this type of abstraction and type of control you're talking about. And it creates a very specific type of problem, which is this mismatch between what we're experiencing now and what's around us. And the classic thing to do in this predictive circuitry is to just stop looking around you as much. Because one of the ways you increase signal to noise ratio is just cut out how many variables you need to deal with. I like to make the simple math analogy. Let's say you got 100 variables and you've got 100 amount of uncertainty that you can handle, and each variable has a range from like 1 to 5. So that means each variable could be 1 off. Well, what if it gets more than 1 off? The best thing is to do, let's just cut down to 50 variables, and each variable could be 2 off. No worries. Why don't I cut it down to 2 variables and I can be 50 off? Fantastic, right? This is what we're doing. The other version of that is to say, which is the healthier version, is say, no, these 100 variables are really important. I have to relax how well I need to predict them. That there's one measure of error for each one of these. Well, maybe I need to relax and say 2 is okay. Or maybe 2 is not okay and I got to find other ways to deal with it. But this is really at the heart of it. And it's something weird about the reward structure that we're really, really interested in the reward structure. The reward for predicting really well is dopamine. The reward for what Stephen is saying, this stuff of values, essentially the here and now molecules, are again serotonin, but vasopressin, oxytocin, all the things that make relationships go round. That's what that feels good. So when you have really well developed circuitry of a person who can do future and here and now, you have an adult who's got sofrosune, and they can cultivate reward from either source. But right now, most people cannot stand the here and now. They have real problems with the here and now. There's something strange in all the universal things I study. Like everybody has a real problem with just being in the here and now. And I think it's just the brain getting so leveraged in this type of predictive circuitry. It has a real hard time doing the other because that's not essentially it hasn't developed those highways. They're like little off-beaten roads as opposed to the massive super highways that I got on my predictive circuitry. Right? I want to take the freeway. I don't want to take the cart and buggy. Right? So, anyways, the point is that I think that's what's the heart of what you're saying. And the key is to develop in most of these things the here and now molecules, which is essentially increasing how much you're updating and looking into the world to adjust your models. Interesting. God, Ari, stop talking about me here. Yeah, I'm trying to talk about everybody here,
It's
but
all
thank
of
you.
us,
Yeah.
right? You're right on, Ari. We all
But
recognize.
the thing, you nailed it. When does this fail? When you stop getting reward from your own little worldview that just doesn't, somehow it figures it out. And then you stop getting the reward. You're like, oh, well, I got to get the reward from somewhere else.
Yes.
It's not so it's a bad idea. I got to get the reward from here and now from the people around me. And then I have to engage in the world very differently. And then I have to care about their needs. And then I have to care about like all these things. And again, the idea is essentially from an infant who only cares about themselves, which is interocepting, which is internal world stuff, and an adult, or ideally, let's call it a proper adult in our language, an aristos is almost exclusively exterocepting. They're completely concerned about what it means in the real world to other people in the future, all this stuff, right? They're in the world for that sake. That's what sofrosune really means, being connected and aligned with whatever around you, and you're going to be mutually beneficial for those ecosystems. Interoception is all about your internal ecosystem, and it has nothing to do, right? So you want to align these two, and we're finding the hard way our ecosystems are not aligned. Yeah. So, anyways, that was what I wanted to say. So I hope that was good. Thanks.
Thank you, Ari. I see Sharon wants to add something.
I want to ask a question. I'm trying to interpret this. Is that called experience then growth? When you have to change your brand because it doesn't work anymore? That's what it is, right? I'm trying to.
Yes.
I hear the Greek names, but I have to reduce it to something practical that I can understand.
Yes. This is, and you're anticipating exactly what I'm going to talk about next. You're doing a great job, Sharon. That's the question, right? This is the issue. So Socrates gives us a clue. Well, Plato gives us a clue when he quotes Socrates in the Apology, when Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. And why would he say that? I mean, why can't we just live the way we feel like we should live? Why can't we just believe the things we believe? And the explanation here is that the externally driven acculturation, which your parents and teachers and so on manufacture a person. They practice anthropoculture and they generate you. They finish you, to be a person. It actually doesn't finish you. It only half finishes you. You're at that point, you're sort of at a childlike early adolescent stage. And to become an adult, you have to recapitulate what's been done to you. You have to go back and look at it again and see how much of it is functional and how much of it is not functional, how much of it is healthy and how much of it is not healthy. And if you don't do that, you're just going to repeat all the sins of the previous generations in the new generation. If your dad had an anger management problem and tended to hit the family members, and you never do anything to address that, then the odds are when you grow up, you're going to hit your children and your family members because you're monkey see, monkey do. That's what you've been acculturated to do. The only way you break these cycles is to ask hard questions. It's to be able to go back to all the things that feel right to us, even if they're completely artificial, that we're enthusiastic for, that we take as normal, and to ask, is this actually healthy? Is it actually good for me to be like this? To do a filtration process. And the goal of the filtration process isn't to overturn everything you learned, but to keep all the stuff you learned that was healthy, but to reject the things that you learned that aren't healthy and to consciously decide to take responsibility for that stuff. I mean, this goes back to that quote from Elizabeth Gilbert. I've never seen any life transformation that didn't begin with the person in question finally getting tired of their own bullshit. This is what Socrates is talking about. We have to own our baggage. We have to recognize we have it. We have to take ownership of it. And then we have to decide how are we going to transform ourselves to address that baggage and become better people. And that's the part when we begin changing from childhood to adulthood. And Kenneth and the Greeks and Nietzsche and plenty of others would say the problem is most people skip that part. They never go that far. They stop at a late childhood, early adolescent state, and they live that way for the rest of their lives, trying desperately to live inside the brand, trying desperately to live inside the frame of what they've been taught and had modeled for them, and therefore carrying on all the mistakes of the past into the future. It is a minority of people, usually those who are sort of sidelined into some kind of catastrophe as a result of their own character, that finally ask the hard question. I wonder if maybe some of what I learned is bullshit. I wonder, maybe I do have an anger management problem. Maybe I should get some help in figuring out how the hell I became this way and how can I become somebody different. This also takes me to one of my very favorite Heraclitus quotes, which is sort of an expansion. Granted, he wrote before Socrates did, but it's kind of an expansion. Men are deceived in their knowledge of things that are manifest, even as Homer was, although he was the wisest of all Greeks. For he was even deceived by boys killing lice when they said to him, "What we have seen and grasped, these we leave behind, whereas what we have not seen and grasped, these we carry away." The parts of yourself you never examined still rule you. Only the parts that you've examined do you have the chance to rule them and be a person, to individuate yourself and become a new, somebody unto yourself. To what extent are you just a symptom of your culture? And to what extent can you individuate out of that to become a person? It requires studying yourself and grasping each part to figure out if it's healthy or not healthy, and consciously deciding to change those parts of yourself that are not healthy. This is why they have anthropoculture as a core value in Hellenic culture, in the Hellenic worldview. It's based on this idea that the purpose of knowing yourself is to no longer be a puppet of your culture or a symptom of your culture. It's to allow yourself to grow beyond it. And the hope is if you find something sick that has been passed into you, and then you're able to grasp that it's not healthy and come up with a way to transform yourself to overcome it and behave differently, then you have the potential now to put that new perspective of healing back into the culture, to teach it to others. And then they can maybe learn to raise their children better than your parents raised you. The goal is to do incremental improvement through this process of radical searching and investigation and transformation and communication. And this is part of how the Greeks imagine the relationship between ethos and culture is supposed to work across multiple generations. is this process of refinement and improvement. So where does that leave us? Well, let's start with now we're gonna oh, go ahead, Sharon, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I just wanted to say, in establishing the early Christian churches, this is one of the things that Paul advocated for: accountability among the participants. And that's why I think, even though there was so a lot of discord around the actual theology, right? But the mechanism of how they were going to establish the churches, that's why the early Christian church survived, because of the way they treated each other. And you can tell in Paul's dictum from his letter to the Galatians, to the Thessalonians, that it's about caring for each other, the fruits of the Spirit. And that was the built-in accountability.
That's right. And that addresses the question Ari just asked in the chat, which is, if all you do is think about your behavior and try to think about what's good, then you get stuck overthinking and you get into a little noesis loop and things become worse. But it is through praxis. It's through the actual, you watch your behavior and its effect on people, and you talk about it with people, so that as a community you can figure out when the things that you've all been doing are maybe not helping you. And then you change your standard. Why did they have these sayings collections from Jesus in the early days of Christianity? Because they wanted to check their own behavior against what Jesus recommended. And by having it in writing, it would harder to forget that he wanted you to do this thing. Because look, it's right there. It's line 5. And so they'd look at line 5 and they'd look at their behavior and say, I think we're not doing this right. So this is also core to the Greek. It's this dialectic between thinking and acting. You can't understand your actions unless you think about them, but you can't understand your thoughts unless you act on them and find out how they manifest in the world. And it's the back and forth of the dialectic. That's how you avoid becoming stuck in your head. So Kenneth Smith loves this particular quote. He uses it as his main epigraph for his book Webs. The wise only possess ideas. The greater part of mankind are possessed by them. That is, who is the master? Are you the master of your own mind and your ideas? Or are your ideas the master of you? Are you reduced to the level of being a puppet of an ideology such that you're not necessary? Any puppet of that ideology would do fine. You're all just replaceable little Xerox images, mimicking each other, like a totalitarian movement of the kind Hannah Arendt talks about in The Origins of Totalitarianism. Or have you put in the work to take possession of your ideas and critique them and decide which of them actually work out in practice, which ones are healthy, which ones are good, and edit yourself to become a better person? And of course, the process of anthropoculture largely, once you've thought about what something about yourself that isn't working, what makes it anthropoculture is not that you had the realization, but that you practice a new habit. And you practice it over and over and over until through repetition, it becomes a habit. So the praxis can't be eliminated here or shortchanged. It's a major component of the transformation. So you have to do a certain thing for a certain amount of time before your neuroplasticity adapts to that new way of behaving. And now you can do it. But until you got that far, it was an effort each time, and you could easily have been distracted or forgotten. And then you would have lost your way again and gone back to the way that you'd been before. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. So one of the things that are actually pretty interesting when you think about this is this idea of really kind of obviously pattern seeking. And you've already kind of talked about this idea of how you're looking at it from a social level. And this is the idea of self-knowing. So you look at it from the cultural perspective, and the kind of the agreements, the arts, everything that you have within your culture. And then you kind of start to look at it at the individual level. And then kind of understanding that is the most important thing is, and this gets to the whole point that you were kind of talking about, is that there's this kind of like idea that you're never fully going to know. Obviously, the unreliable narrator, the stories that you tell yourself. But there's this other aspect of it too, is that how there is a element of like people think they know themselves through psychology. Like you can change yourself, but it doesn't mean you know yourself. So there's like, and that's what I would say is like this is the difference between philosophy and psychology. So you can use behavioral techniques at an operational level and just say like this is I'm gonna you know do these types of behaviors and I will change the outcome of how I'm doing. But the deeper inquiry that you're kind of trying to get to is that, you know, is that who you are, right? And so it's a complex process. It's not you know, because you can make the change and think that changes that you're making are actually a way of kind of understanding yourself. But that sometimes you're fooling yourself in that process. So that's an important distinction because at some point there is this perception that you have about yourself that it will actually be distorted based off of, I don't know, false positives. So you can be, you know, extremely successful and, you know, think that you're doing everything the right way. But that's also the example of like where you need to step outside the culture as well and say, what does it really mean to be successful too? So anyway, it's an interesting layered process because there's an awareness and then there's even the whole concept itself. And then there's the identity that one develops in that process. So it's kind of, you know, it's not, it's complex is the way I'm saying it, is that and the idea of the awareness is this idea of higher and lower self. So you have, you know, your intellectual aspects of things, and then you have your obviously your actions, your automatic habits. But the interesting, you know, thing is that I had a friend that actually had written quite a bit about this from a different perspective, just using different words. But he would call it like inquiry and action. And, you know, and they had a whole kind of way of kind of designing your life around that. But the essay really spoke about was the idea of the role of storytelling in that process, and you know, and how the inherent limitations of like just self-referential systems and in general. And so the stories that we're telling ourselves, the unreliable narrator, always kind of leads to this way you're continuously inquiring. Yeah, I mean that was just one of the things that I mean that's kind of I've been listening to what everybody's been saying because this is, you know, I often find that people can learn to change themselves, but they're not really, you know, they're just going deeper into the, you know, the culture and not necessarily discover anything about their own personal identity. And then, yeah, anyway, that's just some ideas.
Thank you, Joe. It's very helpful. I mean, it's part of the way out of the trap, right? To recognize that how I am now is not me. How I am now is the lower me, the me that just
Mm-hmm.
happens to be here at the moment. But there's a deeper me that is able to ask whether I couldn't be better than this, whether there are in fact things in myself that I have a responsibility to take ownership over and to understand, and some of those to change. And the enduring higher me is the me who cultivates myself to try to be a better person over time. You know, but can I, through the process of growing up, am I ever going to be offered the possibility of even thinking these thoughts? Or am I going to be taught,
Right.
you know, that I should just be confident in who I am and that what's important is strength and, you know, and beating off all opposition?
Yeah, that's a major problem. I mean, essentially, and that's where you're managing yourself just to the culture itself and not to your own personal values, and that creates a certain dissatisfaction, if you will.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's, it is a process where you kind of start to reevaluate it. How do you best improve your judgment? And you best improve your judgment by challenging your beliefs.
Yes.
And if you're challenging your beliefs, then your principles. You have a set of principles that hopefully are governing what you're doing.
Yes.
But this is also fundamental to being creative as well, is because you start to imagine things differently, including yourself.
Yes.
So this is why it's like an artistic aspect to it as well. And you can even go through this is related to how we look at the difference between knowledge and understanding and wisdom. That there's a process that goes that you're progressing through, and
Yes.
and essentially is part of it is wisdom. It's obviously this element of evaluated understanding. Anyway, yeah, I've thought a lot about that actually recently.
It's good stuff, Joe. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes. And this is what Coleridge is alluding to, and it's why Kenneth Smith cites him when he says the greater part of mankind are possessed by their ideas. They don't possess them, they're possessed by them. Is that it has never occurred to them that it would be a good thing to question their ideas. Because they think their ideas are who they are. And if they questioned them, it would make them weak. And they're afraid of that. They're afraid of weakness and lack of confidence and vacillating and seeming, wishy-washy more than anything else in the world. And so the result is they cling to the poison that they should spit out. They're not willing to say, but if it's making me sick, maybe I should change. They're like, no, that would be the worst. Nothing could be worse than that. Uh, Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, two things. First, I just wanted to follow up on something that you said, Rick, where you said great minds discuss ideas, and you took me all the way back to my childhood, where my father said, small minds discuss people, average minds discuss event, but great minds discuss ideas. And so therefore, you need to go sit down and get those ideas and read and study. And I smiled to myself because I could hear him saying it. That's just a sign. But the second thing I wanted to say is that knowing yourself is a very, very difficult task. And it's a very difficult task. And this is where scriptures or faith or religion comes in, because you have to have some kind of barometer and along which you're going to assess yourself, right? And that's what the early Christians were doing, right? They were going to believe in the teachings of Jesus Christ, follow it, and through that, you would acquire spiritual maturity, spiritual goodness. And I think from the paragraph down from the one we're reading, Kenneth talks about it. He says, the cloud of unknowing, the unexamined life, normalized as ultimate, beyond whose limits no one may go, is not pure and simple, innocent provincialism or ethnocentrism such as existed for millennia before there were telemedia or even dispersion of the printed word. But the rest of the paragraph outlines how difficult this task is. And it's not for the simple-hearted, because most people don't do it, because it's too difficult. And self-examination is very, very painful.
Yeah, inherently. That goes to what Ari was saying. Once we become set in our ways, it's not that we're not still neuroplastic. It's that our brains are now going to punish us anytime we try to push ourselves in the direction of neuroplasticity. We can do it. We just have to be willing to suffer the torment that comes from the effort and the difficulty. And many people never, just like some people never acquire a taste for spicy food, some people never acquire the taste for, aha, I feel my brain pushing back. I see this is something my brain doesn't want to talk about. That means I do want to talk about it. I want to know why I'm stuck on this. I want to get unstuck. And if that hurts, then it's just like stretching my legs. I need to stretch in order to have more flexibility. That's the price, right? And I want to pay that price because that's how I get to a better place. I'm gonna quote more from this Samuel Taylor Coleridge quote. This was in his notes. He was reading Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, and then he wrote a comment on it. So here's the paragraph of Robinson Crusoe that made him come to the conclusion that he did, that I quoted up above. He says that Kenneth quotes all the time. But my ill fate pushed me on now with an obstinacy that nothing could resist. And though I had several times loud calls from my reason and my more composed judgment to go home, yet I had no power to do it. I know not what to call this, nor will I urge that it is a secret overruling decree that hurries us on to be the instruments of our own destruction, even though it be before us, and that we rush upon it with our eyes open. So, this is Robinson Crusoe. Daniel Defoe is writing Robinson Crusoe's thoughts and wondering why can't he stop himself? Why can't he restrain himself? He sees this part of himself rushing on, even though he thinks this would be a terrible thing to do, but I can't seem to help it. And it's similar to the way that an alcoholic who's on the cusp of realizing he's got a problem is. He's like, I start to notice myself doing things, and I think to myself, don't do that. It will wreck everything. Don't do it. And then I do it anyway. And I go, oh my God, there must be some force in me. There's some drive in me that I didn't know about, that I was in denial about, that has enormous strength to make me do this thing, even while I'm thinking, no, stop. And it won't. And it's me. That's how you start to be able to separate the higher self and the lower self, to realize that what you're doing is the lower self, and your capacity to critique it and change yourself is the higher self. So, in response to this, this is where Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet, in his notes in his notes about Robinson Crusoe, this is what he says then. In response to that paragraph, he says, the wise only possess ideas. The greater part of mankind are possessed by them. Robinson Crusoe was not conscious of the master impulse, even because it was his master, and had taken, as he says, full possession of him. When once the mind, in despite of the remonstrating conscience, has abandoned its free power to a haunting impulse or idea, then whatever tends to give depth and vividness to this idea or indefinite imagination increases its despotism, and in the same proportion renders the reason and free will ineffectual. Now, fearful calamities, sufferings, horrors, and hairbreadth escapes will have this effect, far more than even sensual pleasures and prosperous incidents. Hence, the evil consequences of sin in such cases, instead of retracting or deterring the sinner, goad him on to his destruction. This is the moral of Shakespeare's Macbeth, and the true solution of this paragraph. Not any overruling decree of divine wrath, but the tyranny of the sinner's own evil imagination, which he has voluntarily chosen as his master. And so, this is why Kenneth likes to he doesn't stick with one source of ideas. He's like, this guy's a poet and he's reading a work of literature, but he's thinking about it deeply and insightfully. He's thinking about it analytically, and in an anatomizing way. And in doing that, he's exploring, he's saying Daniel Defoe has clearly seen something in himself about the way his own brain works differently than the way he wished it would work. That it's possible for the brain to have these unconscious drives that are stronger than our conscious decision making. And by making it so crisp in this paragraph, of Robinson Crusoe, he's given Coleridge the opportunity to think about it in his own life and go, God, he's right. Defoe is right. This is something that's in our brains. And now, as a result, All these years later, Kenneth Smith reads it and goes, "Ooh, yes, that's philosophy. I'm seeing epistemology here. I'm seeing revelations about the structure of the human mind, and they're not being conducted scientifically. They're just being found through people being insightful about their ordinary experiences and documenting them in a way that other people can partake." So this is part of why Kenneth Smith writes the way he does, is to invite us into this conversation that's been going on for thousands of years. Because in that conversation, you can never predict who it is that's going to notice something that other people never noticed before and put it into language in such a way that it can become clear. And so every time Kenneth, quotes that particular, nugget of this, about the wise only possess ideas, the greater part of mankind are possessed by them, he's drawing in this whole analysis that the poet Coleridge has about the fiction, the novelist Defoe, and what he's come to understand about human nature. And of course that leads to us in the present, because what it means is the extent to which we can be ruled by our ideas means that the artificialisms that have been put into us before we got mature enough to begin asking questions about ourselves are already warping our ability to ask questions about that artificiality. The artificialism doesn't want to be seen. It doesn't want to be grasped or possessed. It wants to be in charge. It wants to be grasping and possessing us. It wants to maintain the dominant position over us. And to that extent, it's fully capable of warping our self-perception to such an extent that that we don't know who we are. We imagine ourselves to be the brand and not the reality. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So bringing up Wolfram von Essenbach's Parsifal. Of course, we can't ignore that one, Nietzsche and Wagner, when Nietzsche fought, to embrace the old Nordic culture, he was there with Wagner and saw all these large fat German sausage eaters thinking they were Siegfried. And he was captivated by it until one day he looked at it and felt like barfing and left. And well, in the original story, you have, of course, Percival, and he contends with the Black Knight, Cleansall. And the thing about the two of them, that Percival's an idiot. He's a knight and he just runs around, and it's sort of hidden in the story, but he's doing, he's forcing himself on maidens. He's robbing people. He doesn't seem to really see that there's a problem with all that. He meets Gawain, who's the older knight, who realizes his problem is he's too impressionable and you need to get a grip on yourself. So that was sort of his first lesson. After a while, he eventually, he finds himself in a miserable state after doing all the things that are supposed to be fun. He's, literally, he's sort of lying in a gully somewhere, just he can't be bothered. And then he meets Trevisan, the old hermit, or Obi-Wan Kenobi in the story, who explains who he is and what his role in the world is. So Percival has an epiphany. But the trouble with Cleansall is he was a really clever guy. He was sort of top of the class, and he was a Black Knight. He wanted to serve God, and he felt if he served God, he would be rewarded with happiness. And somehow that didn't come along. He just found himself serving God. And then, like Salieri in Amadeus, he throws a cross at the wall and says, "I want my revenge on you. I'm going to revenge myself upon the Christian church and goodness, because I tried goodness and it didn't reward me." So we have one guy who does a whole load of bad things and gets sick of being bad, has the epiphany. And then we have the other guy who starts out as a good person and then gets sick of being good because it doesn't reward him. That difference is that Percival accepts responsibility for his mistakes. He realizes he's the one that has to change. Whereas Clinzor's looking for something external to himself. The father figure God had been the external. And that didn't work for him. And he's still, well, then he serves Satan as the external. But he doesn't accept his own part in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, this is the recurring theme, right? How badly can we go wrong when we refuse to own our own baggage, when we need it to be somebody else's fault? Can we dilate our spirit enough to encompass the truth of who we are, or do we insist on remaining so narrow that the truth of who we are can't fit in our conscious mind, and then we reject it and we run away to, well, some kind of escapist danger. I mean, like the one who decides to embrace the devil, because at least then we have an explanation. So, this theme of, are there parts of ourselves that are outside of our control, but that we need to become aware of and take responsibility for? This is something that ancient Greeks just took for granted. But for millennia, the rest of us have been trying to catch up and find ways to talk about these ideas. Another one Kenneth likes is Auden's In Memory of Ernst Toller, um, where he has the line, "We're lived by powers we pretend to understand." And the stanza that's from says, "We're lived by powers we pretend to understand. They arrange our loves. It is they who direct at the end the enemy bullet, the sickness, or even our hand." And this poem is a mourning memorial poem that Auden wrote for his friend Ernst Toller, who committed suicide. And no one saw it coming. They all thought of Toller as this vital person who is trying to affect change in the world and was an inspiration to them all. And then one day they wake up and find he put a bullet in his head, and they're all just blown away. How could he, of all people, be the one to commit? It's like how everyone was shocked when Robin Williams committed suicide. Here's the guy who makes us all laugh and think about our lives and how to be better people. And then one day he does that. And and so, through this, Auden comes to understand that um, like Robinson Crusoe, as described by Daniel Defoe, so too it must be that Ernst Toller had something inside himself he didn't understand. He didn't know it was in there brewing, and it took possession of his hand. And the whole time he thought it was his choice what he was doing. But actually, it was this deep, potent impulse within him that owned him, that possessed him, that told him he'd never been good enough and he never would be good enough. And he might as well erase himself. That idea that we are not all in control it's the foundation of modern psychology. Freud talks about it, Jung talks about it, all of the great psychologists talk about this idea of the preconscious or unconscious part of the mind, and the mind and our relationship to it being more like an iceberg, where the part that we're conscious of is just a tiny fragment of the vast stretches of the mind. That on the one hand, it's a very modern idea. All of psychology is based on it. But on the other hand, Heraclitus says the same damn thing when he says, the soul is huge. You could spend your whole life exploring the soul and not come to the ends of it, such as its depth, its profundity. And that's part of his argument that as amphibians, there is the vast infinite world around us that we have to explore, but there's also this vast infinite world inside of us that's every bit as infinite that we have to explore. And as we explore it, it's also at the same time growing larger, and we can't ever catch up. We'll always be at a disadvantage. But by doing it, at least more and more of ourselves we can bring under conscious understanding and control. So, artificiality, it's not just a matter of, does somebody have a good idea, and it might be good and it might be bad, but they implement it, and now we all have this thing inside of us. The trivial example is commercial jingles of the 70s. Everybody of a certain age, plop, plop, fizz, fizz. Oh, what a relief it is. I mean, if you're a certain age, you know that melody by heart. It's in there. It will always be in there. Displacing God knows what important fact about the world you don't have room for because you got that instead. You know,
That's
I can,
absolutely with me too. I always think about that commercial more than any other one. That
right?
one, and McDonald's is your kind of place. Those are the only
Yes,
two that stays in
yes.
my brain
I
all
mean,
those years.
if we were stuck somewhere and bored out of our minds, we could spend hours singing commercial jingles to each other. There's so many of them, and they're all in there. And we could have sacred songs about how to live in brotherhood with one another, but instead, we're full of this crap, right? And it's in us, and it's pushing on us, and it's pushing on us when we're asleep and we can't make conscious decisions. It's pushing on us outside the range of our vision of ourselves. So that's the most innocuous form. And the less innocuous form is ideas that we have that teach us that we shouldn't engage actively in our own politics. We should just go with the flow. You all heard go with the flow? How does that, if you were living in the realm of nature, go with the flow might be wise, but we're living in nature too, as Phil warns us. We're living in artifice. And going with the flow means going along with somebody's idea about how to dispose of us. Somebody says, I would like all of your life savings. What happens if you go with the flow? You know, I mean, there are people out there who do not have our best interests at heart, and they would like us to go with the flow. And so, you know, the culture generally is always pushing us to pacify us, to infantilize us, to teach us to let our betters, our representatives, that they can think about all the hard things. And we'll just read the newspaper and maybe grumble and then get back on with our lives because we've been taught not to govern ourselves. We've been taught that politics is gross and icky and we should stay away from it. And so we do. And then the result is we wake up one day and there's a big totalitarian movement taking over our country. And we're like, well, when the hell did that happen? And the answer is it could have happened at any time because we weren't fucking paying attention. I mean, right? We've been taught not to. We've been taught to be infantilized. That is a power that has been implanted in us. We've been brainwashed, not through a conspiracy, but through the convergence of all of these different forces of modernism that are trying to create great masses of manipulable people. Why? So that you can get them to vote for you, so you can get them to buy your plop plop fizz fizz oh what a relief it is, so that you know there's all these advantages if you can reduce people down to being a kind of manipulable resource. If you can change people from individuals into masses, you can wield enormous power in the modern world. So it's not a coincidence that our education and our mass media information sources and our politicians are all constantly reiterating over and over and over these truisms that aren't actually true. They aren't healthy, but they're in our heads because they put them there. And now we are lived by those powers that make decisions for us while our conscious mind is just going with the flow. This is what it means when he's talking about we don't understand the extent of the artificialism. He means we're being lived by somebody else's designs. And it's not even as good as if a single person sat down and designed a system. That might at least be coherent. But this is the result of thousands of people who have had enough money and influence at one time or another to get their memes pushed into the culture. And they were at cross purposes. So we're pulled one way and then another. Everybody is an individual. We're all unique snowflakes. Remember that? Oh, but at the same time, we're all the same. We're all equal. Remember that? Well, these are contradictions. How do we not notice that we hold these simultaneously hold contradictory ideas about our relationships to each other? We have this incoherency in us. And so what happens is one or the other takes the reins whenever it's convenient for it, and the other one takes the back seat. And we never even notice that there's this discontinuity in our reasoning when we hopped from one idea to a completely incompatible one and used it to rationalize what we just did or didn't do. This is Auden's concern and Kenneth Smith's concern. And all of this is tied up with his concern about artificialism. So what does that mean for us? What does artificialism mean for us? Here's the next bit. Paul Valery, The Outlook for Intelligence. Oh, what a good book that is. That was one of the first recommendations that Kenneth Smith recommended. I I got that book and I just ate it up. It's full of amazing essays. Um, it, it, Paul Valéry was a Frenchman. He was writing especially between World War I and World War II, although he, as you can see from the date there, he also wrote during World War II. And he was writing in the wake of the Great Disillusionment that happened after Europe sent an entire generation of men to be mowed down by machine guns. And then at the end of it, everyone came home and said, I don't even understand why we fought that war. The worst war we've ever fought, and we don't even understand what was at stake. Why did it even happen? Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated? What the hell? What does that have to do with me? Why am I how is that so important that all of us have to die? And the answer at the end was before World War I, there were all these people who believed in the myth of progress, that modernism was modern, that everybody was before us was obsolete, and that we were going to stride into a bold utopia of our own designing, armed with science to guide us and technology to enable us. We were going to basically, this is where the idea of the Star Trek universe comes from. We're going to it's going to get better forever. We're going to apply human reason to solve human problems. But then instead we fought World War I. And afterwards, everyone was like they'd been slapped hard in the face. They're like, what? How does that fit into our great march of progress? That we would do this stupid thing, that we would be destructive on such an inconceivable scale and for no apparent reason. So Paul Valéry becomes one of the expatriates who's writing critically about the modern world. The things that Nietzsche had done generations before, a number of writers, but especially Valéry, are doing after World War I, where they're starting to say there is something wrong with the modern promise, and we don't know what it is, and we'd better start digging and trying to figure out what it is. So Valéry, in this essay on unpredictability and the outlook for intelligence, is talking about how prior to the discovery of electricity, everything science studied was intuitive. Anybody could understand it once it was explained to them. I mean, simple machines, a pulley, a lever, a screw, a ramp, anybody could understand these things and use them in their lives. He says, but the first time people twisted some wires together and then somehow a current appears and now the current can do things. What the hell? It's like magic. It doesn't, I mean, the most experience most people have with electricity is seeing a lightning bolt in the distance or zapping themselves with static electricity. How you get from that to electric lighting and electric cars and giant generators and turbines, it really is. He says it's a step at which our language and intuition began failing us, in which the most important parts of our world were being decided by kinds of science and technology we had no intuitive understanding of. And our metaphors for it, like juice, the line has juice in it, are actually more confusing than helpful. He says, we've reached a point where our ability to describe and understand the things that we do is falling behind. We're able to do things that we actually can't give any clear words to or any clear understanding to. And this is a turning point in the artificializing of the nature two around us and the nature two within us. It's a turning point because we're now reaching a point where we can't track anymore clearly how we've been artificialized because we don't even have words or concepts for the things that have been done to us. Things are happening to us that we can't even think clearly about. To understand whether it's even a good thing or a bad thing, we can't even manage that. We can't even express it, who it is that we're becoming. And Valéry says, we're going to someday rue this transformation in our relation to the world, because the law of unintended consequences, that when we try to do a good thing, sometimes a bad thing happens too. That's already bad enough, even when you almost completely understand the situation. because at least you can try to avoid the law of unintended consequences. You can try to plan ahead. You can try to think about all the things that could go wrong and try to design a better plan so that fewer things could go wrong, or the things that go wrong would be smaller things. You can do that if you've got the words and the concepts to understand your situation. But if your words and concepts have failed you, now it's just a throw of the dice. You have almost no control over how big the law of unintended consequences is going to kick your butt. You don't understand anymore how to predict what's going to happen. He says, the genie's out of the bottle and the genie isn't taking our orders. The genie has its own ideas what it's going to do. And, God help us all. And of course, he's writing this 1944. He's writing this during the Holocaust. The genie is truly out of the bottle. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
The great tragedy of World War One had been predicted by the Marxists in the Internationals, that the workers of the world would just be exploited again and sent to fight the war for the capitalists. 1890s, 1880s, early 20th century, they were discussing this. We know that the big war is coming. Well, this time, guys, the workers of the world will unite, stand up to the bosses and say, sorry, we're not going to fight your war. We're not going to be somebody, the bayonet who has a worker on each end. We're not going to be sucked in this time. What happened? They got sucked in, even though they knew. Now, the fascinating man in all this is Mussolini, because he was a Marxist. He saw what was going on. He realised that Marx's thing about the class warfare, and he was part of class warfare, he realised that nationalism is a lot more powerful than Marx figured. Marx concluded that the worker didn't give a toss about nationalism. But World War One demonstrated they did. So Mussolini re-envisioned Marxism as fascism. People will not accept this. They'll scream if you tell a socialist that the fascists were in fact socialists. They were there for the common man. They hated the people at the top. But Mussolini also watched what was happening in Leninist Russia, where they were shooting anybody with a brain, and the disaster it was creating. Lenin was proud of, shooting the kulaks. The smart peasants, let's shoot all the smart peasants who know how to make things work, because we hate them. Mussolini saw also what happened with the Bolsheviks. They started shooting the socialists that weren't socialist enough. And he realised he might become one of the socialists that weren't socialist enough. And he banded together, his socialists banded together with the capitalists and the landowners to protect themselves against the Bolsheviks. He did come to the conclusion, I don't know if he developed it, but the syndicalist idea was that we will develop a socialist state, but we'll let the capitalists be capitalists as long as they realise that their role is to serve the state. The Jews can be Jews as long as they realise that they must pay heed to the state. So the idea was to accept all the people the Bolsheviks wanted to shoot and just say, look, guys, serve us and you can be more or less who you are. So this was the transition of syndicalism. But eventually Mussolini's ideas, they suffered from the same problem of any socialist state, that Italy started to economically break down. But people don't understand what fascism is. They think it's just right. conservative authoritarianism. But no, it wasn't. It was a distinct movement that was built out of a certain series of events. But the great lament after the war, that was terrible. And what did it achieve? Well, certain intellectuals knew it was coming and knew that that was what the story was before that war started. We're all going to be sucked in yet again. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks for joining us, Nelson. Hope we see you again in the future. So I'm going to come back to Ari's comment, which is sweet in a moment. But building on what Stephen was saying, a couple of weeks ago I finished reading Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. There's the link to the Wikipedia article. I highly recommend it. I'm just starting my second read of it. I'm going to be going through sentence by sentence, line by line, and posting things on Facebook about it. And hopefully that will prep me so that when our seminar here gets to modernism, when we finish medievalism, I'll be able to integrate what she did. But a big part of what she's trying to do in this book is she's saying, look, the Holocaust is over, World War II is over, and I'm hearing people try to explain what they think happened, and the explanations are terrible. They're just like they're equating things that are different from each other. They're confusing, like they think Nazism and fascism are identical. And she says, but if you look at the way that Mussolini treated the Jews and you compare that to how Hitler treated the Jews, they're opposites. I mean, Mussolini saved Jews, not only in Italy, but in all the places where the Italian army was working with the Nazis throughout Europe. They would, Hitler would say, okay, it's time to exterminate the Jews. And Mussolini would tell him, oh, yeah, sure, we're going to exterminate the Jews. And then he'd tell his own soldiers, okay, round them up and let's get them back to Italy safe where the Nazis can't hurt them. And then Hitler would blow his top and go, what the hell? Where's my quotas of dead bodies? And Mussolini says, oh, I gave the orders, but you know how these Italian generals are, they don't understand. And sometimes they make mistakes. We'll totally get them this time. And then, of course, he'd smuggle more out of Romania or wherever they were. And the result was, even though a few Jews were killed in Italy by the end of the war, that only happened when Hitler finally lost his he just got too angry and he invaded Italy and he took over and he was able to get some exterminations done. But the vast majority of the Jews in Italy and that the Italians rescued from around Europe, they lived. They survived the war because fascism under Mussolini was a different political animal than Nazism under Hitler. And Hannah Arendt was noticing all these people equating them with each other. These are the same thing. And she's going, well, then why do they behave differently? She says, your means of your words and your concepts are inadequate to the thing that we're facing today. We need to understand the genealogy of Nazi Germany, and we need to understand the genealogy of fascist Italy. We need to know how they got this way to explain why they behave the way they do. And we need to tune up our language to be able to discriminate between things that are different from each other, as well as to compare things that are the same. We can't just lump everything we don't like into a big pot and call it the bad stuff, or we're never going to actually have a reasonable response to the bad stuff. This is kind of how Stephen often pushes us on this issue to try to get us to look below the surfaces and below the cliches and say what's really at work in these countries. And it's never what we think it is. And so she develops this whole framework of the totalitarian movement in the origins of totalitarianism. And she talks about that one of the products of the totalitarian movement is a new form of human personality. And I'm going to talk with Kenneth about this and see what he thinks about it. But Arendt's basically saying, douloi, banausoi, aristoi, yeah, up until totalitarian movements, and now we've got a new fourth thing. And the fourth thing is a kind of morally evacuated human character that we've never seen before, that only is able to function while it's animated by the breath of its dear leader. And when that leader dies, all of these millions of people who are animated by his breath collapse into bags of personality fragments. They spend the rest of their lives as whiny, sad sacks, reliving the glory days and unable to get anything to happen because they had to destroy themselves internally to be perfectly obedient. And now that there's nobody to tell them what to do, they have nothing to obey, and they're just They're half people. They're broken people. She calls this the totalitarian personality. And so she talks about these things in this book, and she draws these distinctions and says, this is what we need in order to understand how these movements function in the world. And yet here we are 80 years later, and when a totalitarian movement arises in the United States, none of us have read her book. And so we all describe it as something that we're more familiar with. Oh, it's tyranny. Oh, it's authoritarianism. Oh, it's fascism. And, she's spinning in her grave. She's like, how do you not see? All these people are angry. How come they're for the Second Amendment when it's white people with guns, but they're against the Second Amendment when it's black people with guns? But even that's not consistent because they're also against the Second Amendment when it's white people with guns, but the white people with guns don't like their movement. Then they're against it. They're like, these people don't make sense. And here's Hannah Arendt in her book saying, of course they make sense. Because totalitarians don't stand for anything. They don't believe in anything. They don't value anything. If they did, the movement would crush them for resisting the will of their leader the first time the will of their leader disobeyed the thing that they believe in. The only people who are left in a totalitarian movement after it's done mass producing them are people who can infinitely be flexible to the day-to-day whims of their leader and perfectly align themselves with it, with no internal resistance at all. And that means they've broken their moral spine in order to be that flexible. She gives us the whole diagnosis, and yet today you'd think she never wrote the book because we're looking at a movement in the United States in which our means of investigating that movement and acting in response to that movement, our means of representing that movement and understanding that movement are far outstripped by what the movement is actually doing. Our concepts are failing us and our words are failing us. And when that happens, we find ourselves ineffectual in the face of things we ought to be effective with. Valerie's talking about it in the context of advanced modern science. I can't remember in this, it's been too long since I read this essay. I can't remember if he talks about quantum mechanics, but remember, quantum mechanics even freaked out Einstein, who at first was opposed to them. He said, this can't possibly be real. God doesn't play dice with the universe. And then later he has to apologize to Niels Bohr, go, no, you were right. I just didn't have the words and the understandings here to follow it. So the problem here is one of when artifice takes us so far away from nature that the kinds of things our language has evolved to give us the ability to name or to think about are left behind. They can't keep up with the strangeness of the fakeness, the unnaturalness of the things that we're making. We find ourselves in a position in which the law of unintended consequences becomes the dominant law over our behavior instead of being a side effect of our behavior. Because now we don't have a way to talk about even the main things that would come as a result of these movements. Donald, you had your hand up. You got to put it up again because I'm sure it's going to be good.
I was just going to say, The Origins of Totalitarianism is not an easy book to read. It doesn't surprise me at all that so few people have read it. And there are other people who have written books on this subject. I don't think they ever quite hit the mark, but it's a remarkable book, and it took me, like you started talking about it like 3-4 weeks ago. It took me 3 or 4 times that. Maybe it took a year to read that book, but, and as I would say, based on that book, many comparisons between, say, Trump and Hitler are total nonsense. But there was a speech recently, or not a speech, he doesn't give speeches or rambling, by Trump that addressed what he called self-sufficiency. What we have learned here is autarky. That is a valid parallel. That was a very common thing of Hitler, his desire for, he was right. Germany lost the First World War because they weren't self-sufficient. They lacked the food growing ability and fuel to fight a war. It's strange that you would hear such things about Trump at Davos saying that every major nation should focus on its own self-sufficiency, which is going to be impossible for almost all of them. There's very few that have the luck of geography, mostly, to do that. The other, I would say, now I don't know about, but Hitler, seeing one of the weaknesses that he had to overcome in reconstructing the German nation was its purification. It was like, I'm not sure Mussolini was racist in the same way that Hitler was. In fact, I don't think. But Stephen Miller within the Trump administration seems to think that, and it was that, and Trump reflected that a bit in when he lectured at Davos on immigration policies in Europe, that you're just letting too many people, you're destroying your own nations through immigration. These are all racial purity things. Now, there are other things where would I think Trump was like Hitler? I mean, Hitler could write a book. Trump can't even read one, so I would say, yes, there are recently some very valid similarities. There are a whole bunch of I think wrong similarities or false similarities or something, but one, at least ideologically, knew exactly what he was doing and why, and had given it careful thought. And I see no evidence that the other has. But
the decaying gray matter is our only hope.
Yes.
decaying,
What
Yeah.
did you say?
decaying gray matter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hitler didn't have the same problem that Trump has.
Yeah, Trump, a book? What is it?
Yeah. Yeah. It's we could obviously spend, an entire year or more talking about
Yeah,
what's the same and what's different.
But it is good. I think that's one of the reasons that Arendt's book is not read so much, is that there is so much of it is 19th and 20th century political history.
Right.
It's not until the end that she sort of, or the end, I don't know, the last quarter of the book, where it's like, well, now you've had all the background. Let's talk about the ideas here and what they mean.
Yes.
So
it's great as an audiobook. Yes. Because then the reader is taking you through the text. And you're not as likely to just stop and get lost, and it's and by the way, the narrator is very good.
Well, I'll have to find my copy. I know it was 30 years ago or more that I read that. It was fantastic. It's a fantastic read, and that like that gives, so that when you're talking about fascism and Nazism or Bolshevikism or communism or whatever, you're not just throwing out words for the deplorables. Yes, these are just groups that are in the deplorables, Stephen. That's a good one. They're just vague categories that you can use to
Yeah.
slander people.
Yeah.
Instead, she has very precise stuff. And I would say one of the things that we don't see is, particularly like in the title, is that totalitarianism is very specific thing. It's governments that wipe out all of the institutions of civil society. There are only government institutions. And I don't see that yet here.
Not yet.
Not yet. And that would be cause for real concern, but I haven't seen that. I'm not
But that would also be too late to react. It's clear from her history that if you wait until after that's happened, you've already lost.
right.
And
Right.
that's why she does the history, right? So we have to see the course of developments and jump on it
Yeah.
before before it fully gets traction.
But
But what you were saying a second ago is right on with why this book is so important, because you look at political debate today and people will call each other, tyrants, fascists, authoritarians, Nazis, as though they all mean the same thing. And it's zero dimensional thinking, because what they're doing is they're saying my little point of politics is goodness, and every other area on the plane or the multiverse, that's all a single point, and that's badness. And so it doesn't matter what I call you, you're bad. Just sit with
right,
it.
it's just name calling.
It's just name calling, right?
So I agree. Now we're perfectly free to go on to sentence 2, Sharon.
Next week is sentence 2.
Oh darn! It's 4 minutes still. Oh,
Because we got 4
How
more
many
minutes.
hints have I given? How many hints have I given?
Yes, I've watched every one. But see, this is the point is, when he's talking about artificialism, it is a huge, deep subject. And there's so much that he means by it. All this stuff about if we're getting to a state where we can't even name the things that are happening to us. But worse, we can't even name the things that we're doing. See, like even when we act voluntarily in the world, we're just sort of using arm wavy ideas to represent it because our languages are failing us. And I'm going to call on Ari and Stephen in a second, but I have to add this Hannah Arendt quote from the Human Condition prologue, another one of Kenneth's favorites. But it could be that we, who are earthbound creatures and have begun to act as though we were dwellers in the universe, will forever be unable to understand, that is, to think and speak about the things which nevertheless we are able to do. So we do things and don't even know what to call them, let alone what the consequences are going to be. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I wanted to say something pretty quick, but it's kind of, again, a wrench in things. Maybe not so much, but add a dimension to Hannah Arendt or ask one. I'm, to be honest, I guess rather new to her as well in the last few years. And I've only read Between Past and Future. And okay, I was going to say, if you're familiar with it, she talks about totalitarianism and they're all over the place.
That's right.
And I was just wondering, we never mentioned that book.
Love it.
Is it really just saying the same thing?
No.
But I don't think so. I feel like we're missing a bunch of her good stuff from there. And I keep thinking you're mentioning this from this other book, but I'm like, even though it doesn't have in the title, there's tons and tons of totalitarianism stuff between past and future. And I guess she's trying to link totalitarianism to like power, but not with like influence, or not hit her word for influence, but what's her word is what
Already.
authority. Perfect, authority, right? So again, it's this idea that it doesn't last. It's not able to sustain itself. It does literally. It's the antithesis of Suffer in some ways. But
Yes.
I digress. It's just the point is she talks a lot about this, and it's like essentially almost like framing it from a relationship with time, so to speak, and what passes the test of time, maybe. Because she's talking so much also about this period in history. It kind of bothered me that she's talking so much about this one narrow spot in history, and I'm like, oh, come on. But I mean, it's really important. So I guess she's like trying to put our laser, red pointed laser to something really important.
well,
But I just wanted to say that I think we should be adding this element of her own whatever that is to what we've been talking about. And I'm not sure how much we're missing. This is where I'm a beginner. I'm where the just past the Dunning-Kruger effect. I don't know very much, but I sniff something. I smell it. But
Yes.
I'm guessing someone else might know exactly what kind of dish is being cooked while ooh, that smells interesting. While someone's like, I know the ingredients to that. So I'm hoping that someone else who knows more could talk about those ingredients, probably, certainly at a later date.
Yes, yes. The short thing to know about Between Past and Future is he wrote it after The Origins of Totalitarianism. It is the guy who runs the Hannah Arendt Center says that everything she wrote after The Origins of Totalitarianism is essentially an appendix to that book. And so what she's doing, and I think he's oversimplifying grossly, and I think Kenneth would agree it's a gross oversimplification, but effectively, one way to interpret her body of work is it's all extensions of and commentary on the breakthroughs that she makes in that first book. So it is I've read Between Past and Future, first. I read What is Authority in that first, and then Truth and Politics later. But Truth and Politics is her successor to Eichmann and Jerusalem, which is her successor to Origins of Totalitarianism, in which she's kind of exploring the impact on how we think and conceive of the world when we've been captured by a totalitarian movement. It's fascinating stuff. Um, but yeah, if you go to Origins of Totalitarianism, the point that Donald made is that she doesn't just talk about one point in history. You get a 300-year swath of history. She gives you a generalization about what came before, and then she goes into depth about the last 300 years of the modern world, and she shows how all the major features of the modern world developed and why they developed. And the whys are almost never what we're taught in school. Like she links racism to the nation state and makes a persuasive argument. I can't think of the modern nation state the same way anymore. She's like, well, why should there be a Serbia? Well, because the Serbians developed a race consciousness. We are Serbians. We need our own state. And she talks about how the entire international framework of the United Nations, the Geneva Conventions, the Nuremberg Principles, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all these things only work for people who have nation states, which is why the Jews were so fucked over by World War II, because they were a people without a nation state. So there was no place to defend them within the international framework of law. And I'd never made any of these connections before I read this book, but she makes them pretty compellingly. So I would go back to that book and then work forward from there because, everything she writes in the later stuff assumes that you've read the earlier stuff.
That's really, I'm sorry to interrupt like this, but when you really think about it, that's really interesting because in like New York, for example, Jewish people overall have tendency to be overachievers, if you want to call them, very productive people. And yet you just said they never had their national state, and that's why they were fucked over like that. It's interesting. They could have, but and yet they didn't. So maybe in some ways that was an asset that as a human race that people didn't appreciate, maybe.
We'll get into this when we get into the modern world. All this stuff she wrote about is going to become part of the discussion. Kenneth Smith takes Hannah Arendt very seriously. She's a major influence on his work. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Remember my warning about democracies, and not just what Aristotle and Plato were warning about. Maybe they did warn about it, but you look at the classic democracies in Europe, Poland, France, Britain, their democracy was supported by vast overseas colonies of people who were not really free. So we supported the grand idea of democracy at home for all our people on the backs of slavery. It's not a good word, actually. There's another word I should use. People are in a sense being enslaved to support your democracy. Isn't it wonderful?
Yes.
This is all the democracies. Athens, what did Athens do? Tried to enslave the Aegean to support the appetites of people back home.
She talks about that a lot in this book.
lot of people in well, I saw the similarity in that how rapidly the Roman Republic began to decline after the Second Punic War when it acquired all the wealth. That primitive Roman virtue was going out the window in 50 years.
Yeah.
They were turning into not the noble sort of Roman of 200 BC. They were turning into the nasty pieces of work of about 150 BC. And 20 years ago, I could see the parallel for America. I realized that there would be a Gracchi coming along. Surprisingly, it's Donald Trump, but some guy gets up and decides that the older Rome was the ideal. I see all these problems. I see all these people who've become good for nothings. There's not opportunity for them. There's not work for them. They demand handouts. You know, Rome had developed a huge dole. How do we feed them? Well, Elon Musk comes along and says, well, we can cut the dole. And Donald goes, oh, that's not going to work. They'll cut my throat. I know. Let's invade Egypt and get them to supply all the grain. Let's invade Venezuela. So this is Donald's in a really bad situation, actually, with the debt and all the problems in America. But here's his easy way out: steal stuff from somebody else, which is what Rome did.
Yes.
Rome, the greatest thief of the Mediterranean in those years.
Yes. Yes.
This is your internal problem, that you've got these lefty protesters out on the streets with their purple hair and whatever, screaming against the government. At the same time, they want lots of handouts. They say it's evil that you're invading Venezuela when they've gone to Venezuela to pay your dole. You know, these lefties, if they really want to sort themselves out, might have to start actually working for a living if they want to be virtuous. And this is why I'm with the other side. I mean, Big Don, I have a personality to follow. As bad as he is, he's something that's there. He's a man. With the left, all I've got is a load of abstract nonsense. As bad as the man is, I would rather follow the man because I know that there's still existentially something that was good there. With a whole load of abstract ideas, which is all the left has to offer. In the war, in the Roman war, the populace eventually won. And the optimates, which is equivalent to the left, were the smart ones. But as David Riol would point out, intelligence is vastly overrated.
Yes.
And the thing with the populace is they had the balls. They might have been a bit dumb, but they had the courage. The other thing that killed the optimates, and this is so true of the left and the Democrats today, is they're outstanding hypocrites. This is what will kill the Democrats. Two things: they might have the brains, but what's going to kill them is they don't have the balls, and they're hypocrites. This is what killed the optimates in Rome. This is why the populists won. You're not going to take that message too well, Rick, but you can have a
It's
think
7
about it.
after, so there's no way I have time to engage this in discussion. So, we'll leave it there for now. But I will add that in the Origins of Totalitarianism, one of the things Hannah Arendt says is one of our most profound misunderstandings of Hitler and Stalin is thinking that they're either on the left or the right. She says almost everybody, she says, makes the mistake of thinking they're either left wing or right wing. And
I'm a ballerina. I can
she
leap
says
to
this
either
is a
side of the
new wing.
stage.
She says this is a new wing. It doesn't obey the one-dimensional left versus right. And yet both sides want to disown it. So each of them accuses the other side of being the one that the totalitarianism belongs to. And she says they're both wrong. She says what Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union prove is that totalitarianism is equally capable of breaking out on the left or the right. And she says, most likely it could break out in the center too, because it has nothing to do with the traditional politics. But you'd have to read the book to get the details. Her analysis is novel, and it really, I grew up being exposed to left-wing interpretations of fascism and left-wing cover-ups of Stalinism. So having her take a completely new approach was just mind-blowing. But I don't have time to go into it today because it's
I
9
was I was
after.
until I was 48.
You gotta hold it for next time, Stephen, because it's 9 after, so we gotta wrap up for today. But thanks to everybody. I hope you had a good time. I certainly did. And next week we get to move on to sentence 2. Woo!